Hello everyone, welcome to my channel. I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Case 1. Willie Tanners, 49, was a well-known and respected figure in the small southern town of Tifton. He owned Tanners Hardware, a local hardware store that had been serving the community for over 2 decades. Known for his friendly service and wide selection of tools and supplies, Tanners Hardware was the kind of place where neighbors could find what they needed, whether it was a simple screwdriver or advice on how to fix a leaky faucet. Willie was often seen behind the counter, greeting customers with a warm smile and chatting about various topics. Willie's life seemed ideal to those who knew him. He was married to Lynn Tanners, 48, his high school sweetheart, and the couple was often involved in local church activities and charity events. However, beneath this seemingly perfect exterior, Willie was hiding a dark secret. Despite his reputation as a devoted husband and exemplary citizen, he had started a secret relationship with Madison Kelly, an 18-year-old high school senior. Madison, known for her striking looks and intelligence, was a regular customer at the hardware store. Over time, a friendship developed, which soon turned into a sexual relationship. Torn between guilt and desire, Willie struggled with his conscience as the holiday season approached. He knew the relationship was wrong, but he couldn't free himself from the emotional entanglement that had developed. The relationship was fiery and extremely intense, with Willie torn between his guilt and his growing attachment to Madison. In the days leading up to his death, Willie appeared distant and distracted, trying to maintain the facade of a loving husband while battling his inner turmoil. As Christmas approached in December 2019, Willie's behavior began to change. He spent less time at home and more time working late. Lynn noticed the change, but attributed it to the stress of running the business during the busy holiday season. Friends and neighbors also noticed that Willie seemed worried, no longer as cheerful as before, but no one could have imagined the storm brewing beneath the surface, a storm that would soon shatter the peace of their small town. It was the morning of December 22nd, 2019, just days before Christmas. Tifton was quiet, with most residents finishing their Christmas shopping or decorating their homes. Around 9 a.m., Lynn Tanners returned home after the Sunday service at First Baptist Church, where she had volunteered to help prepare for the Christmas Eve service. She noticed Willie's truck parked in the driveway, which seemed odd since he had mentioned needing to pick up some last-minute supplies for the store. When Lynn entered their home on Bride Street, the first thing she noticed was the fresh pine scent from the Christmas tree they had decorated together. The tree was still lit with colorful lights, and beneath it were carefully wrapped gifts, some with her name on them. But something was wrong. The house was eerily silent, and Willie did not respond when she called for him. Upon entering the living room, Lynn encountered a scene that would haunt her forever. Willie's lifeless body lay on the floor near the Christmas tree, surrounded by broken ornaments and tinsel. His head was soaked in blood, as if it were a mangled enchilada, and a hammer lay nearby, covered with what she could only assume was her husband's blood. Lynn fell to her knees, her body trembling as she tried to comprehend what she was seeing. Panic overtook her, but she forced herself to stay calm long enough to call 911. Her voice shook as she explained the situation to the operator, tears streaming down her face. "Oh my God, my husband isn't breathing, there's blood everywhere," she cried. The operator tried to keep her calm, instructing her not to touch anything, and to wait outside for the police and paramedics to arrive. Within minutes, the quiet street was filled with the flashing lights of emergency vehicles. Neighbors peeked out from their windows, murmuring among themselves and speculating about what had happened. Lynn sat on the front porch, dazed and in shock, unable to grasp how her life had changed in an instant. The Tifton Police Department arrived on the scene minutes after Lynn's 911 call. Leading the investigation was Detective Nora Collins, a veteran officer with over 15 years of experience, known for her sharp intuition and methodical approach. Detective Collins was respected by her colleagues and feared by criminals. As she stepped out of her unmarked car, she was immediately struck by the contrast between the festive decorations on the Tanners' house and the grim scene that awaited her inside. The living room was a disturbing mix of Christmas cheer and brutal violence. The Christmas lights flickered on the tree, reflecting off the broken ornaments scattered on the floor. Willie's body lay near the base of the tree, his head crushed, apparently by multiple blows with a hammer. Blood had splattered onto the nearby ornaments, soaking the wrapping paper and ribbons. Detective Collins observed the scene, her mind working quickly as she began piecing together what might have happened. The hammer lying next to Willie's body was immediately collected as evidence. The crime scene was bloody, but also oddly contained. There were no signs of a struggle beyond the immediate area around the tree. It was as if Willie had been completely caught off guard. The forensic team arrived shortly after, led by Dr. Philip K. Wong, a meticulous and detail-oriented medical examiner known for his precise work. Dr. Wong began examining Willie's body, noting the severe head trauma, which likely caused an instant death. He estimated the time of death to be between 10 p.m. and midnight the previous night, based on the state of rigor mortis. Detective Collins ordered her team to collect all possible evidence. They took fingerprints, photographs, and searched for any other clues that might point to the killer. They also interviewed Lynn Tanner, who was still in shock but managed to provide a basic timeline of her morning and Willie's activities the previous day. As the investigation progressed, Detective Collins couldn't shake the feeling that this had been a crime of passion. The brutality of the attack suggested deep anger or jealousy, emotions that often fuel such violent outbursts. But who could have hated Willie Tanner so much to kill him in such a brutal way? That was the question Collins was determined to answer. The first person Detective Nora Collins decided to investigate was Madison Kelly, the 18-year-old high school senior, who had also been Willie Tanner's secret lover. She was involved in several extracurricular activities, including the school drama club, where she had recently impressed audiences by playing Tiny Tim in a local production of A Christmas Carol. But beneath her polished exterior, Madison was emotionally fragile, a trait that had become more evident in recent months. Madison lived with her mother, Tammy Kelly, in a small but tidy house on the outskirts of town. The Kellys were known for being private, and Tammy was known in the community for being controlling and obsessed with her daughter's appearance, especially after Madison's father came out as gay and left the family. When Detective Collins arrived at the Kelly residence on the afternoon of December 22nd, she found Madison still in her pajamas, in her room, visibly affected by the news of Willie's death. The room was a typical teenage sanctuary, with posters of pop stars like Taylor Swift and Ariana Grande, but there were also signs of Madison's obsession with Willie. Detective Collins noticed a framed photo of Willie shirtless on Madison's nightstand, and her diaries were filled with graphic entries about their sexual relationship. During the interview, Madison initially cooperated, but quickly became emotional when questioned about her relationship with Willie. She admitted to the affair, describing how they had grown close over the past year. Madison revealed that she had fallen deeply in love with Willie, and had even fantasized about a future together. However, as Christmas approached, Willie had distanced himself, and she feared he was planning to end the relationship. When Detective Collins pressed Madison about her whereabouts on the night of the murder, Madison hesitated before claiming she had been home alone studying for her final exams. Her alibi was weak, and her emotional state raised red flags for Collins. Madison's tears and trembling hands indicated she was under immense stress, but it wasn't clear whether it was from guilt or grief. As the interview continued, Madison's behavior shifted from grieving to defensive. She insisted she had nothing to do with Willie's death, and began speaking erratically, blaming a mysterious man she called Bob for influencing her actions. Madison claimed that Bob had convinced her to maintain a sexual relationship with Willie, or else he would torture her. But when Detective Collins asked for more details, Madison became evasive and confused. Detective Collins wasn't convinced by Madison's story. The combination of her emotional instability, her obsession with Willie, and her weak alibi made her a prime suspect. However, Collins knew she needed more concrete evidence before making an arrest. The investigation into Madison Kelly was far from over, and Collins was determined to uncover the truth behind Willie Tanner's tragic death. The second person on Detective Nora Collins' list was Lynn Tanner's, Willie's wife of 25 years. Lynn was a well-known figure in Tifton, recognized for her deep involvement in the community and church activities. She was a warm and friendly woman, always greeting neighbors with a smile, and often hosting gatherings at her home. Despite the outward appearance of a happy marriage, Detective Collins knew that Lynn had harbored suspicions about Willie's fidelity for quite some time. Lynn had spent the days leading up to the murder preparing for Christmas. She was busy with church events, including the upcoming Christmas Eve service at First Baptist Church. To the outside world, it seemed like Lynn was focused on her faith and family, but inside, she was worried by a growing sense of unease. She had noticed Willie's increasing absences, which he often explained as work-related or part of his commitment to the church. However, Lynn couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. When Detective Collins interviewed Lynn on December 22nd, Lynn was still in shock from discovering her husband's body that morning. Sitting at the kitchen table, Lynn recounted her marriage to Willie, describing him as a loving husband, but also admitting that they had grown distant, and that their relationship had lost its intimacy in recent years, especially after their son, Rifle, went off to college. She confessed that she had suspected Willie was having an affair after he repeatedly rejected her request for intimacy, but she had no proof. Lynn's eyes filled with tears as she spoke about the strain this had put on their relationship, particularly in the last few months. Detective Collins asked Lynn about her whereabouts on the night of the murder. Lynn claimed that she had been at home preparing for the next day's church service. She had gone to bed early, assuming Willie would join her later. But when she woke up in the middle of the night and realized he wasn't there, she thought he had fallen asleep in the living room. It wasn't until the next morning that she discovered the horrifying truth. Lynn's account of the night was straightforward, but Detective Collins couldn't ignore the possibility that Lynn's suspicions about Willie's infidelity might have driven her to commit murder. The brutality of the crime suggested a deeply personal motive, and as Willie's wife, Lynn had both the opportunity and a potential reason to kill him. However, Lynn's grief seemed genuine, and her cooperation with the investigation was unwavering. She answered all of Collins' questions without hesitation, and even provided access to Willie's personal belongings, including his phone and computer. Still, Collins knew that emotions could be powerful motivators, and she wasn't ready to rule Lynn out as a suspect just yet. The investigation continued, with Collins keeping a close eye on every detail of Lynn's story. The third name on Detective Nora Collins' list was Tammy Kelly, Madison Kelly's mother, a woman with a strong and controlling personality. Tammy was known in Tifton as a perfectionist, always concerned with appearances and maintaining a strictly orderly home, especially after her husband left her when he came out as gay. She was active in the community, often organizing events at the local church, but her primary concern was her daughter, Madison. The relationship between Tammy and Madison had always been tense. Madison, young, beautiful, and full of sexual potential, had been the object of Tammy's obsessive fear. Tammy's control over Madison extended to every aspect of her life, from the clothes she wore to her social interactions. It was well known among neighbors that Tammy had very high expectations for her daughter, and was often harsh when those expectations were not met. There were even rumors that Tammy disciplined Madison severely, with one particularly disturbing story claiming that Tammy would spank Madison whenever she thought her daughter was attracting too much attention from the men in the community. Detective Collins approached Tammy on December 23rd, the day after Willie Tanner's body was found. Tammy was at home, seemingly unperturbed by the previous day's events. She welcomed Collins into her immaculate living room, decorated with traditional Christmas ornaments, including a perfectly adorned tree and a nativity scene. Tammy was calm and composed as she spoke, but there was an underlying tension in her demeanor. On the other hand, defense attorney Karen Blackwell, 45, known for her sharp but compassionate legal mind, argued that Madison had been mentally unstable at the time of the murder. Blackwell claimed that Madison had suffered a psychotic breakdown, driven by the fear of losing Willie and the intense pressure of their secret relationship. She urged the jury to consider Madison's difficult family life and the influence it had on her mental state. Blackwell painted a picture of a vulnerable young woman, manipulated by an older man, who ultimately crumbled under the pressure. Throughout the trial, Willie's family sat in the front row, their faces marked by grief. They listened in silence as the details of Willie's double life were exposed to the world. The pain of his betrayal was evident, but so was their deep sorrow for the loss. After several days of deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict on February 18, 2020. Madison Kelly was found guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 25 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after 15 years. The sentence sparked mixed reactions. Some thought it was too lenient given the brutality of the crime, while others believed it was a fair punishment, considering Madison's youth and mental disorder. Willie's family expressed relief that the trial was over, but they knew the scars of this tragedy would remain with them forever. After the trial concluded, life in Tifton, Georgia, slowly began to return to normal, though the memory of the crime lingered. Willie Tanner's hardware store, once a community hub, closed its doors for good. Without Willie to run it, his family decided they couldn't carry on with the business. The closure marked the end of an era for the small town, leaving a void that would be hard to fill. Madison Kelly was transferred to a state prison, where she began serving her 25-year sentence. Despite her attempts to feign mental illness during the trial, psychiatric evaluations in prison found no evidence of schizophrenia or any other condition that could explain her actions. Madison spent her days in relative isolation, with few visitors. Her once promising future was now a distant memory, replaced by the harsh reality of a life behind bars. Lynn Tanner, Willie's widow, struggled to cope with the revelations about her husband's double life. Knowing that Willie had been unfaithful with an 18-year-old was a heavy burden to bear. Despite the support of her church community, Lynn withdrew from public life, choosing to grieve in private. She eventually sold the family home and moved to a nearby town, hoping to start anew, far from the memories that haunted her. Tammy Kelly, Madison's mother, faced her own challenges after the trial. The scandal had brought shame to her family, and the tight grip she once held over her daughter's life had crumbled. Tammy became a pariah in the community, and many blamed her for Madison's downfall due to her controlling nature. Tammy also withdrew from public life, avoiding the judgmental glances of her neighbors. For the residents of Tifton, the events of December 2019 served as a painful reminder that even in a closed-knit community, secrets can fester and lead to tragedy. That year's Christmas celebrations were more somber, as the memory of Willie Tanner's murder cast a shadow over the festive season. It would take years for the community to heal, and even then, the story of Madison Kelly and Willie Tanner would be remembered as one of the darkest chapters in Tifton's history. Case 2. Zephany Nurse. Many folks associate high school friends with nostalgia and simpler times, recalling moments of laughter at the lunch table and inside jokes during class. Yet, for one young woman, the seemingly ordinary bonds of a high school friendship became the key to unraveling the truth about her real identity, forever reshaping the trajectory of her life. Zephany Nurse was born on April 30th, 1997 in Cape Town. She was the daughter of Celeste and Morn Nurse. Zephany's life took a tragic turn soon after she was born on March 30th, 1997, when she was just 3 days old. On that ominous day, a woman disguised as a nurse infiltrated the maternity ward of the hospital she was in and abducted the newborn Zephany from her unsuspecting family. 17 years later, Cassidy began attending a new school and became friendly with a girl 4 years her senior, called Mitchie. The bond between the two girls grew so strong that they became inseparable. Meanwhile, their classmates couldn't help but notice the striking similarities between them, leading to the suspicion that they might be more than just friends. Even Cassidy was intrigued by the uncanny resemblance to some extent, and she shared her suspicions with her parents. The nurses, filled with a mix of hope and trepidation, decided to investigate further. They discreetly obtained a sample of Mitchie's DNA and had it compared to Cassidy's. The results were nothing short of astonishing. Mitchie was, indeed, Zephany Nurse, the long-lost daughter of Celeste and Mornay Nurse. Living most of her life under a different name, Zephany was raised by Lavonda Solomon and her husband, Michael. Solomon had abducted the young girl after posing as a hospital nurse. Growing up, Zephany had no knowledge of her true identity or the circumstances of her abduction. She attended school, made friends, and built a life completely unaware of the family searching for her. With the truth finally out, Solomon was arrested and charged with kidnapping. During her trial, she testified before the court that prior to taking Zephany, she had endured a series of miscarriages, the last of which was concealed from her family and had occurred 4 months earlier. She also insisted that she received baby Zephany through an informal adoption and asserted that she had been tricked into taking in the abducted child. Dismissing her account as a fairy tale, the judge sternly informed Solomon that her sentence would be more severe due to her refusal to acknowledge the truth or express any remorse. In the end, justice was served as Solomon was sentenced to 10 years in prison. As for her husband, it is believed that Michael never knew Michelle was not his daughter until the police arrested his wife. At first, Zephany didn't exactly approve of the woman she viewed as her mother being incarcerated. She even went as far as severing all ties with her biological parents. Nevertheless, over time, Zephany chose to give her real parents a chance, leading to a positive relationship with both sides that has endured ever since. There isn't a quick fix. I mostly live from day to day. My mother, who raised me, will always be a part of my life. Delamar Vera. It was a chilly December evening back in 1997. Luzera Cuevas, a 31-year-old mother of three, was out job hunting while her boyfriend, Pedro Vera, visited some family. Their kids, two young sons and a precious 10-day-old baby girl named Delamar Vera, were being looked after by Pedro's mother. When Luzera made it back home at around 5 p.m., she found the second floor of her Philadelphia home was engulfed in flames. Everyone had managed to escape except for baby Delamar. In a panic, Luzera rushed inside to find her daughter, only to discover Delamar's charred crib. The young girl was nowhere to be found. Luzera kept pleading with the firefighters, screaming her lungs out that her baby girl was missing. But unfortunately, nobody listened to her cries. She was sent to the hospital to get treated. She had burn injuries, yet she hadn't even noticed or cared. Her daughter was the only thing on her mind. Later on, a police report would acknowledge that Delamar met her demise in that fire. She was pronounced dead, even though her remains were never found. The case was opened and shut very quickly, but Luzera remained adamant that her daughter was still alive, and in fact, she believed Delamar had been kidnapped. After all, there were no remains. The crib was empty after the fire subsided, and the window to Delamar's room was left wide open, even though it was freezing outside. For years, Luzera told her story to anyone who would listen, but everyone just dismissed her as crazy, and the authorities didn't take her seriously. No matter how many times she pleaded, they declined to initiate an investigation, and even Pedro advised Luzera to forget about Delamar and move forward. They would later have another child before permanently separating in 2000. Even though everyone in her life had given up on her, Luzera never stopped, believing that her baby daughter was out there somewhere. Then, in January 2003, she was invited to a children's birthday party hosted by Pedro's sister. Also in attendance was Carolyn Correa, Pedro's 41-year-old cousin by marriage. While at the party, Luzera couldn't help but notice that Carolyn's 6-year-old daughter, Alia Hernandez, bore a remarkable resemblance not only to Luzera herself, but also to baby Delamar, as both shared a similar dimple pattern. The little girl even resembled Luzera's other children. Luzera called little Alia over in a gentle, kin-caring voice and informed her that she had gum stuck in her hair. She carefully pulled out a few strands and wrapped them up in a napkin. Later on, Luzera reached out to the authorities expressing her suspicions that Alia was Delamar, but officers dismissed her claims as too far-fetched. Instead, Luzera approached State Representative Angel Cruz, who couldn't ignore a mother's intuition. With his help, investigators were persuaded to conduct a DNA test. The test was a match. 6-year-old Alia Hernandez was indeed Delamar Vera. Carolyn was taken into custody, and a subsequent DNA test confirmed that she was not the biological mother of the little girl. Consequently, she was arrested and charged with kidnapping. Luzera was joyously reunited with her daughter. Within a month, Delamar found herself happily embraced by Luzera and her 3 newfound brothers. Eventually, Pedro would secure shared custody, ensuring a bright future for the young girl. Years passed, and Delamar reflected on her journey. She expressed profound gratitude for rediscovering her true mother and treasured life she shared with her caring siblings. But how did little Delamar end up with Carolyn in the first place? It was discovered that Carolyn had visited Luzera on the day of the kidnapping. On the evening of that same day, Carolyn returned, taking baby Delamar with her, and then starting the fire in an attempt to conceal any evidence of kidnapping. Turns out, it wasn't her first time setting a fire in the neighborhood either. In 1995, she had also set a clinic ablaze after allegedly being fired due to committing fraud. Later that night, Carolyn contacted her boyfriend, Andre Moore, and informed him that she had given birth back home. They chose to name the baby Alia. As his baby got older, Andre began to suspect that she wasn't really his, leading him to request a paternity test, which ultimately revealed that he really was not the biological father. After breaking up with Andre, Carolyn took on the role of raising Delamar as her own child in her Philadelphia home, which was only 3 miles away from Luzera's residence. Despite the results of the DNA test, Carolyn insisted that Delamar was actually her own baby, Alia. But there was a significant issue with her story. Carolyn had undergone a tubal ligation in 1990. A tubal ligation, also known as female sterilization, is a permanent birth control procedure that involves cutting or blocking the fallopian tubes, preventing eggs from being fertilized by sperm. In other words, Carolyn could not have physically given birth to Alia. Later, Carolyn claimed that she had an affair with Pedro Lazara's boyfriend, and that he had given her Delamar willingly after she suffered a stillbirth. However, there were no medical records to substantiate Carolyn's claim of pregnancy or childbirth. Pedro vehemently denied her allegations, and investigators ultimately concluded that he had no involvement in the kidnapping. Another strange twist in the story was that, according to forensic psychologists, Carolyn was diagnosed with pseudocyesis, a condition where a woman falsely believes she is pregnant. The psychologists also noted that Carolyn genuinely believed that Delamar was her child. The judge, on the other hand, didn't buy that Carolyn was mentally unstable and ruled that her actions were deliberate and malicious. As a result, Carolyn was found guilty of kidnapping, arson, assault, concealing the whereabouts of a child, and interfering with the custody of a child. She was sentenced to 9 to 30 years in prison. Tanya Kosh, 13-year-old Tanya Nicole Kosh, was an ordinary young woman who lived an exemplary life. She excelled in her studies, constantly pushing herself to make the honor roll list. But she also had a bubbly personality that lit up any room she was in. Enthusiasm was contagious, and it was clear to all around her that Tanya had a bright future ahead of her. She was also quite mature for her age, and would always follow her parents' instructions to the letter. So when Tanya didn't arrive home after school one day, everyone knew something terrible must have happened. 6 months before Tanya's disappearance, her middle school had just hired a new security guard, Thomas Hose. Hose was a middle-aged man with slightly tousled jet-black hair. He had an easygoing attitude, and the children he interacted with seemed to regard him fondly, often finding themselves smiling whenever he altered up one of his characteristic witticisms before school. When she first met Hose, Tanya was just 13 years old. Despite their age difference, the pair developed a special bond. She was drawn to Hose's kind nature and his willingness to listen to her troubles. Their bond grew stronger over time, so much so that Hose would frequently pull Tanya out of class just to talk with her. Initially, Tanya was charmed by the attention that Hose gave her. He knew how to make her laugh, and would often buy her cigarettes and candy. This resonated profoundly with young Tanya, as her parents were going through a difficult divorce at the time, which made her vulnerable and desperate for attention. Weeks later, Tanya was pouring her heart out to Hose about the struggles she faced at home. Sensing her despair, Hose proposed an idea that promised a reprieve from all the grievances that weighed heavily on the young girl's mind. Why not run away and live with him? Tanya agreed without hesitation. She would have to live with the consequences of this mistake for the rest of her life. Tanya's house was only 2 miles away from Hose's house. As soon as they got to her new home, Hose immediately showed his true colors. Tanya was forced to stay in the second-story bedroom because Hose lived with his parents and wanted to keep her presence a secret. Whilst imprisoned, Tanya had little freedom. She couldn't leave her tiny cell for anything, not even to use the restroom. Instead, she was given a bucket and some toilet paper. She was only allowed to shower once or twice a week, and only when everyone else was out or asleep. To avoid making noise, she had to memorize and carefully sneak around the creaky floorboards. Tanya's plight seemed never-ending. For 4 years, Hose's was the only face she laid eyes upon. The extent of the horrendous abuse she suffered didn't stop there. Hose would often beat her mercilessly, threatening to end her life should she refuse his demands, and constantly reminded her that she was now his property. It was a living nightmare, one that seemed impossible to escape from. Her saddest hours were the holidays, especially around Christmas. During that time, she would stay alone in a closet, listening to the sounds of laughter and gifts being exchanged from downstairs. 3 years into her kidnapping, her father, Jerry Kosh, actually met her kidnapper. He was attending a school event. It was there that he ran into Thomas Hose, who was working as a security guard. The two got to talking, and Jerry even asked Hose if he heard anything about Tanya. Hose replied that he hadn't. A year later, Tanya had turned 18. It was then that Hose finally decided it was time for her to meet his parents. He introduced her as Nikki Allen, and explained she'd be moving in to live with him. While this meant that Tanya was finally allowed to leave her upstairs bedroom, she still couldn't leave home without Hose by her side. It took 3 more years before she was allowed to go outside by herself, and had to return home on a strict deadline. She began frequenting a local deli mart run by the Sparico family. Over the next 8 months, Tanya slowly grew closer and closer to the owners, Joe and Janet Sparico. One day, in March 2006, despite feeling uncertain they'd believe her, she mustered up the courage to tell them her story. "If you go to a website for missing children, you will see a picture of me there," she said. Without hesitation, Joe and Janet contacted the Center for Missing Children and were shocked to learn that Tanya had indeed been reported missing for 10 years. Unsure what to do next, Joe Sparico called his son, Sean, a retired police detective. Sean had actually worked Tanya's case in the past. Her photograph even hung in his office for years, and he immediately recognized her. The following day, 24-year-old Tanya breathed a sigh of relief as the nightmare had finally ended. Hose was taken into custody. As for Tanya, she was escorted outside the prison she called home by police officers and waited patiently for her dad to pick her up. During his trial, Tanya took to the stand and testified to the horrible abuse she suffered at Thomas Hose's hands. But Hose didn't stand idly by. He interrupted her, claiming he didn't want to see her living on the street, that he thought he was rescuing her. "You took away my innocence, my childhood," was her reply. Hose faced up to 100 years, but in the end, he was only sentenced to 15 and was prohibited from ever contacting anyone in the Kosh family. As for Tanya, her joyful reunion with her family was short-lived. Her father blamed her for what happened, telling her, "You knew what you were doing." He even sued Tanya after the publishing of her New York Times best-selling book, Memoir of a Milk Carton Kid, The Tanya Nicole Kosh Story, in which she claimed her father's neglect made her easy prey for Thomas. Natasha and Ryan was born in Rockhampton, Queensland in 1984. Boasting a population of 68,000, Rockhampton was known for its close-knit residents and kind-hearted community. As a child, because she learned to walk at a very young age, her father used to call her Grasshopper. But while Natasha's upbringing was warm and filled with joy, a darker chapter in her life was about to unfold. In her early teenage years, her parents suffered a strenuous relationship which ended with a divorce. Natasha was forced to live with her mother while her father remarried and moved to Queensland. Her father's departure took its toll on young Natasha. Perhaps she was desperate for someone else to fill the gap, someone who could give her the love and attention her father used to provide. Or perhaps she simply felt depressed, angry, and betrayed. At only 14 years old, she started experimenting with drugs and developed an illicit relationship with Scott Black, who was 7 years her senior. Soon afterward, she began running off from home without warning, leaving her mother in a constant state of worry and distress. In July of 1998, Natasha vanished while taking the family dog for a walk, only to resurface later that week at an outdoor music venue in Rockhampton. After further investigation, police discovered that she'd been staying with Scott at a hotel. Initially charged with abduction, Scott was later let off with a fine for obstructing a police investigation. While Natasha's rebellious behavior could certainly be interpreted as a desperate call for help, sadly, it would seem to fall on deaf ears, as her latest escape attempt wouldn't be her last. On August 31st, 1998, Natasha's mother dropped her off at high school, but Natasha never returned home that day. Authorities were called and the police relentlessly searched for her, believing that she'd likely run away with Scott again, as she had done in the past. Scott was interrogated and his home searched, but was presumably cleared of any wrongdoing after police scoured through his property, only to come out empty-handed. Months went by, and no trace of the young woman could be found. Her family began fearing the worst, as despair slowly crept its way onto their hearts when 3 local adult women and a 9-year-old girl went missing. Police investigators began looking for probable suspects. Their search eventually brought them to Natasha's childhood friend, Mayowa Takutau, who was 15 years old at the time. Mayowa was the last person to see Natasha before she vanished, and he and his family were placed under 24-hour surveillance by the Queensland police. When Mayowa turned 16, police announced they had gathered enough evidence to charge him with Natasha's murder, even though Natasha's body hadn't been found nor any other credible evidence procured. It looked as if the only thing they had on Mayowa was the perceived sense of guilt that he seemed to carry, as he sent flowers to Natasha's mother every Mother's Day since her daughter's disappearance. But thankfully, the charges against Mayowa were dropped when a new suspect entered the picture, notorious serial killer Leonard Fraser. Described as a predator of the worst kind, Leonard Fraser was a classic psychopath and cold-blooded serial offender. With Fraser in custody, investigators breathed a sigh of relief, as they felt certain he was to blame for all the local disappearances, including Natasha's. Yet, initially, Fraser adamantly denied taking her life. While awaiting trial, another prisoner secretly working with investigators approached Fraser and managed to spark a conversation with him. This exchange then segued into an abhorrent confession. Fraser admitted to having murdered 5 people, including Natasha Ryan. According to Fraser, he had encountered Natasha at a local cinema and offered her a ride home, which she accepted. But instead of fulfilling his promise, he murdered her inside his car, then dumped her body in a nearby pond. But despite having been the one who committed the murder, Fraser seemed oddly clueless about the body's whereabouts, failing miserably in leading investigators to where it was allegedly disposed of. Nonetheless, with Natasha believed to be dead, her family was beyond devastated. In 2001, a memorial service was held for Natasha on what would have been her 17th birthday. But perhaps they should have clung on to hope, because as her loved ones mourned her passing, Natasha was alive and well. This whole time, she'd been living in secrecy with her old boyfriend, Scott Black. The two had been moving around frequently, which explains how the police couldn't find her when they first came knocking at Scott's door. In fact, their last hideout was located within a stone's throw away from Natasha's original North Rockhampton home. Black had been employed at a local dairy factory for many years, yet none of his colleagues ever suspected he was harboring someone else. The clothing line outside his home only carried his personal laundry, and all appearances were that he lived alone. Whenever someone came around for an unannounced visit, Natasha would hide inside Scott's bedroom cupboard until his visitors left. Usually, however, Natasha would be free to roam around the house however she pleased. Content with this reclusive lifestyle, she kept herself diligently occupied with tasks such as cooking, reading books, sewing garments, and exploring the internet. She spent many years within the confines of Scott's home, yet only ventured out on a few occasions, either to switch homes or take late-night strolls along the beach. But in 2003, only 3 weeks prior to Fraser's trial, she decided to reach out by contacting a specialized counseling service dedicated to helping children in need. Perhaps the impending trial of a man accused of her murder began to weigh heavily on her conscience, or perhaps she felt it was finally time for her to return home. Regardless of the circumstances, using a fake name, Natasha eventually got hold of a counselor and mentioned that a man was going to be on trial for her murder. She identified herself to this counselor as a runaway living with her boyfriend. The message was then relayed to law enforcement, but all efforts to trace the call proved fruitless. Even though police investigators now had strong reason to suspect Natasha was alive, they still couldn't pinpoint her precise location, or at least that was the case, until police officers at Rockhampton Station received a mysterious letter. The letter didn't disclose who it was from, but it contained an enclosed phone number and simply reaffirmed that Natasha was alive and well. On the night of April 10, 2003, officers from the Rockhampton Police Department forcefully entered Scott's home on Mills Avenue. When they opened the bedroom cupboard, they were greeted with a frightened, pale-looking Natasha. Her skin, after having lived without sunlight for 5 years, had grown white as snow. On the 12th day of Fraser's trial, an astonished gasp echoed through the courtroom as prosecutors announced that Natasha Ryan had been found. When Robert Ryan, Natasha's father, heard of this, he assumed it meant her remains. But when he was told his daughter was alive and well, Robert could hardly believe it. He had given up hope years ago and completely resigned himself to the idea that his beloved daughter was gone forever. In all of this miraculous news, Robert almost collapsed in the courtroom. Robert, still in a state of shock and disbelief, called the police station where Natasha was being detained. To ensure it wasn't just someone pretending to be Natasha, he asked the woman who answered the phone for the childhood nickname he had given his daughter, only to hear the words, "Dad, it's me, Grasshopper, and I love you and I'm sorry." As for Jenny Ryan, Natasha's mother, she was understandably furious. After all, Natasha had led everyone to believe she was dead all these years, all while living a mile away, no less. But in the end, when Jenny finally laid eyes on her daughter, embracing her after all that time, all feelings of anger and resentment melted away as tears of joy streamed across her face. As redundant as it may seem, the now 18 years old Natasha later appeared at her own murder trial to testify that she hadn't been murdered by Fraser, much less ever met him. While Natasha's testimony certainly looked to be beneficial to Fraser's case, it didn't really matter in the grand scheme of things, as he was still found guilty of 4 other murders and sentenced to life in prison. He died of a heart attack 4 years later. As for Natasha, her return home was filled with joy, relief, and pain all at once. The happiness of seeing her alive and well was obvious in the elated expressions of her beaming parents as she stepped through the door. Yet there was also an undeniable heartache that came with it, a sorrowful reminder of the unbearable anguish they had gone through in her absence. Natasha herself faced a great deal of criticism from the general public and was even vilified by some news outlets. After all, how could she leave her family behind without saying a word? In 2005, it was reported that Scott Black, Natasha's boyfriend, had been given a 1-year prison sentence for lying to police about his girlfriend's whereabouts. Later, in 2006, Natasha herself was found guilty of creating a fake police investigation in order to pay a fine of $4,000, as well as restitution of $16,000 for the cost of the investigation. Natasha had endured a tremendous amount of public scrutiny, mockery, and humiliation since then. But in the end, it was her misfortune that proved to be her fortune. She leveraged the attention and publicity she received and used it to generate a substantial amount of profit for herself. She did this by selling the rights to her story to Australian news outlets and magazines, earning close to $150,000 Australian dollars. In 2008, after she and Scott got married, she sold her wedding photos for another $200,000 Australian dollars. Today, she and Scott are still married and have had 3 kids. Case 3. Inside a cozy home near the woods, a man collapsed to the floor, struggling to take his last breath. A few seconds later, his wife rushed out of the bedroom, confused and terrified by the noise. What she saw stopped her in her tracks. A figure stood in the living room, holding a gun. For a brief moment, everything was silent. Then more shots. By the time the sun came up, the house was completely still. Nothing was stolen. There was no sign of a break-in, just 2 bodies lying side by side, covered with a blanket, almost like someone wanted to hide what had happened. Who could have done this? And why? As detectives began digging into the case, they uncovered a disturbing story, one that no one in this quiet town was prepared for. Brian and Beverly's story started on a warm spring evening in 2001, when they met at a mutual friend's party. Both were college students at the time, and from the moment their eyes met, there was an undeniable connection. What began as friendly curiosity quickly turned into a deep bond, and before long, they were inseparable. That summer, their relationship grew stronger as they introduced each other to their families. Both sides welcomed their new partner with open arms, instantly recognizing how well Brian and Beverly complemented one another. Their shared love for adventure and excitement made them a perfect match. Beverly had always been an energetic and talented athlete, excelling in baseball and track. Beyond sports, she played the guitar effortlessly and had a gift for learning new languages. Her warm personality and bright smile made her a favorite among friends and peers. Brian, on the other hand, had a taste for thrill and risk. He was drawn to extreme sports like rock climbing, surfing, and scuba diving, always looking for the next challenge. He had a deep appreciation for adventure, never letting fear hold him back. Despite their strong bond, they weren't in a rush to marry. Both were committed to finishing their studies first. After graduating, they focused on building a future together, saving up to buy their own home. Brian started working in an industrial company, while Beverly pursued a career in hotel administration, where her language skills proved invaluable. On May 15, 2006, they finally exchanged vows in a breathtaking seaside ceremony, surrounded by close family and friends. Their honeymoon was an adventure of its own, taking them to several countries before they returned home to start the next chapter of their lives. They settled in the quiet town of Graham, Pennsylvania, purchasing a beautiful house near a river and a dense forest. It was the ideal place to lay down roots. Brian continued his work as an engineer, and Beverly shifted her focus to translation work while also pursuing further studies. They quickly became part of the local community, making friends and embracing their peaceful new life, but their happiness was short-lived. On the morning of November 17, 2007, Brian's longtime friend Stephen arrived at their home as planned. He and Brian had arranged a fishing trip, but when he knocked on the door, no one answered. At first, he assumed his friend had overslept. He knocked again, louder this time, but the silence from inside the house made him uneasy. Thinking Brian might have simply forgotten, Stephen waited in his car for about half an hour, trying to call multiple times. Still, there was no response. Frustrated but not yet alarmed, he eventually decided to go fishing alone. As the day passed with no word from Brian or Beverly, Stephen's unease grew. That evening, he returned to their house, knocking once more. The silence was unsettling. This time, he decided to take a closer look. Circling the property, he peered through the windows, but the house was dark. Something didn't feel right. When he reached the garage, He noticed that Brian and Beverly's car was parked inside. That made no sense. If they were home, why weren't they answering? Walking to the living room window, he pressed his face to the glass, straining to see inside. The dim light outside made visibility difficult, but something on the floor caught his attention. The television was overturned, and next to it was a large, unmoving shape. Stephen's pulse quickened. He rushed to his car, grabbed his flashlight, and directed the beam through the window. What he saw made his blood run cold. Lying motionless on the floor were two bodies, partially covered by a blood-soaked blanket. A bare foot was visible on one side, a lifeless hand on the other. Panic surged through him as he fumbled for his phone and dialed 911. His voice shook as he reported what he had seen, urging authorities to come immediately. He remained outside the house, waiting, unable to tear his eyes away from the tragic scene. When officers arrived, Stephen was the first person they questioned. He explained everything, the planned fishing trip, the unanswered calls, and the horrifying discovery. He couldn't shake the feeling of regret, wishing he had checked the windows earlier. Inside, the scene was grim. The front door wasn't locked, nor did it show any signs of forced entry. That alone raised suspicions. In the living room, Brian and Beverly's lifeless bodies were found just as Stephen had seen them. Preliminary findings suggested they had been dead for at least 12 hours. Each had sustained 3 gunshot wounds from a large-caliber weapon. The precision of the shots indicated that the attacker was deliberate, possibly even experienced. But why? There was no evidence of a robbery. Nothing was missing. Their wallets, phones, and cash remained untouched. There were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anyone had tried to fight back. It was as if whoever had done this had come with one goal in mind: execution. One disturbing detail stood out. The bodies had been moved after the murders. Blood smeared across the floor revealed drag marks, and the perpetrator had made a clumsy attempt at cleaning up. Smudged streaks of blood marred the walls and furniture, mapping out the brutal sequence of events. Despite the effort to erase evidence, forensic specialists could still follow the trail. 6 spent shell casings lay at the scene, carelessly abandoned. The evidence suggested that a single assailant had fired every shot, and likely, there was only one person responsible for the crime. The lack of forced entry raised another troubling question. The door had been unlocked, suggesting that Brian and Beverly had willingly allowed their killer inside. Investigators theorized that Brian had answered a knock at the door and recognized the visitor. Perhaps he had turned to lead them into the house when, without warning, 3 bullets struck him in the back. One of the rounds passed through his body, shattering the television screen and sending it crashing to the floor. The sound must have drawn Beverly from the bedroom. She likely froze in horror at the sight of her husband's lifeless body and the armed intruder standing over him. She ran, but didn't make it far. 3 bullets struck her from behind, cutting her down in the hallway. Her body was later dragged to the living room, placed beside Brian's. Both were still wearing their pajamas, suggesting they had been attacked in the early morning hours before they had even begun their day. One perplexing detail remained. The killer had covered the bodies with a blanket. Was it an act of remorse, an attempt to conceal the brutality of the crime? No one could say for sure. The floor was smeared with blood, as if someone had tried to clean it, but only made the mess worse. A large stain near the bodies had been partially disturbed, as if someone had attempted to scrub it away. Behind the couch, officers discovered a plastic broom with dried blood clinging to its bristles. The handle, however, had been meticulously wiped clean of fingerprints. This suggested the killer had used it to sweep away bloody footprints, but had taken care to erase any trace of their own identity. Smudged handprints and palm prints dotted the walls, doors, and furniture, too distorted to yield a clear match. Despite the killer's effort to obscure their presence, forensic experts knew one thing. The longer someone stayed at a crime scene, the greater the likelihood of leaving behind an incriminating clue. And then they found it. On the blanket covering Brian and Beverly's bodies, there was a faint but crucial detail, a boot print. It wasn't a blood stain, but rather an impression left on an area where only a light layer of blood had settled. The pattern was distinctive. Forensic analysis determined that it came from a rare model of heavy-duty work boots. Investigators traced the boots to a construction company in Clearfield County that had recently purchased several pairs. With this lead, they narrowed their focus to employees who had access to them. Another potential breakthrough came when detectives found a palm print on one of the house's surfaces. It was carefully analyzed and run through law enforcement databases. No match. The perpetrator had no criminal record and had never been fingerprinted. That meant they weren't in any known offender registries, making the identification process far more difficult. Naturally, the first person under suspicion was Stephen, the friend who had discovered the bodies. He had visited the house twice that day and had been the one to alert authorities. His involvement in the timeline raised some eyebrows. When detectives questioned him, Stephen was visibly shaken. He explained that he had assumed Brian and Beverly were still asleep when they hadn't answered the door that morning. It wasn't until later in the day, when he still couldn't reach them, that he returned and decided to investigate. Once he realized he was being treated as a suspect, Stephen was shocked. He claimed he had spent the entire day fishing at a secluded spot but since no one had been there with him, he had no alibi. Investigators, however, had tools at their disposal. They reviewed footage from traffic cameras along the roads leading to and from the fishing area. The recordings confirmed Stephen's timeline. He had indeed been exactly where he said he was. Further forensic testing cleared him as well. His fingerprints didn't match any of those found at the scene, and tests for gunshot residue on his hands and clothing came back negative. Additionally, the boot print at the crime scene didn't match his shoe size, and he had no connection to the construction company that had purchased the boots. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime, Stephen was officially ruled out. Hoping for another lead, detectives canvassed the neighborhood. When they knocked on the door of Daniel and Jennifer Tavares, who lived across the street from Brian and Beverly, they finally got something useful. Daniel answered and explained that his wife, Jennifer, was at work, but he was happy to speak with them. He recalled that on the morning of the murders, around 5:30 a.m., he had heard loud noises coming from the couple's home. At the time, he hadn't thought much of it, but in hindsight, he realized they had sounded like gunshots. Curious but wary, Daniel had glanced out the window and noticed a white pickup truck parked near Brian and Beverly's house. He was sure the vehicle didn't belong to them. Moments later, he saw two men exit the house. Due to the dim pre-dawn light, he couldn't get a good look at them. However, he did manage to note key details about the driver of the truck. The man was white, around 40 years old, with a solid build. He had long dark hair pulled back into a ponytail and a mustache. Daniel also noticed that the man had a tattoo on his left hand, though he couldn't make out the design. Despite this promising lead, no one else in the neighborhood had seen the truck or its occupants. During an interview with detectives, Beverly's mother recalled a troubling conversation she had with her daughter just months before the tragedy. Beverly had mentioned a neighbor, Jeremy Flint, who had made her feel uneasy. Jeremy, a 22-year-old man, had a reputation that had already drawn law enforcement's attention. Known for dealing illegal substances, his home was a frequent stop for questionable visitors, and other neighbors had voiced their concerns about his presence in the community. Given his history, investigators considered him a person of interest. When officers went to Jeremy's home, they found it empty. Their immediate thought was that he had fled after committing the crime. However, speaking with local residents revealed another potential motive. Shortly before the murders, Brian and Beverly had hosted a small gathering at their house. Jeremy, uninvited and heavily intoxicated, had barged in. Witnesses recalled his erratic and aggressive behavior, harassing women, insulting guests, and stirring up conflict. After a heated exchange, he was forced to leave, but before storming off, he made a chilling threat. The couple would regret humiliating him. The next morning, Brian and Beverly discovered that several items were missing from their home, including a cell phone and a handgun with ammunition that had been stored in a pantry drawer. Convinced Jeremy was behind the theft, they confronted him at his house. Though they remained calm, they made it clear that if their belongings weren't returned, they would report him to the authorities. Jeremy denied taking anything and refused to hand over the stolen items. But the following day, the missing belongings mysteriously reappeared in the couple's backyard. Though they had no proof, Brian and Beverly were certain that Jeremy had sneaked onto their property at night to return them. While the situation seemed resolved, Beverly couldn't shake her unease. She began to fear being home alone and urged Brian to consider moving to a different neighborhood. Jeremy finally resurfaced several days after the murders. Detectives immediately brought him in for questioning, but their suspicions quickly began to fade. As it turned out, Jeremy had been out of town when the crime took place. He had traveled to another state to visit his parents and stayed with them for nearly a week, only returning the day after the killings. His alibi was airtight, confirmed by multiple witnesses, which placed him miles away on the night of the murders. Further forensic analysis sealed his innocence. His fingerprints and palm prints didn't match any found at the crime scene, and he had no connection to the distinctive work boots investigators had linked to the case. With no evidence tying him to the crime, Jeremy was eliminated as a suspect. With their strongest lead gone, investigators found themselves back at square one. Desperate for a breakthrough, they revisited the only witness who had provided useful information, Daniel Tavares. Daniel had initially reported seeing a suspicious white pickup truck near Brian and Beverly's home around the time of the crime. But when detectives spoke to him again, his story had changed. Suddenly, Daniel claimed he could now recall details about what the perpetrators were wearing. He even described one of the men saying he had a scar on his cheek. This contradicted his original statement, where he had insisted that the men's faces were obscured by hoodies. Sensing something was off, detectives asked Daniel to show them the window he had looked through that morning. When they examined the view, they noticed that, even in broad daylight, it was difficult to make out clear details of anything across the street. Considering that the murders had occurred before dawn, it seemed impossible that Daniel could have seen so much. His shifting story raised a chilling possibility. Had Daniel been lying all along? And if so, why? A deeper look into Daniel's background revealed a disturbing history. Born in 1966 into a strict military family, Daniel's early years were marked by hardship. When he was 4 years old, his parents divorced, leaving him and his 3 older sisters in the care of their mother. His father quickly remarried and distanced himself from his children, showing little interest in their upbringing. By the time Daniel reached 9th grade, his life had spiraled out of control. He dropped out of school, frequently ran away from home, and became involved in petty theft. At 18, he was arrested for robbery for the first time. Remarkably, his estranged father intervened, helping him avoid jail time by securing a probation sentence. Perhaps motivated by guilt, he wanted to give his son another chance. But Daniel squandered it. Over the years, he continued his descent into crime, repeatedly being arrested for theft and drug-related offenses. Each time, he received light sentences. In the late 1980s, Daniel's father made one last attempt to set him on the right path. He brought his son to Florida, paid for an expensive rehabilitation program, and even helped him find a stable job. It didn't last. Within 6 months, Daniel was caught stealing again. This time, his father gave up on him completely and sent him back to live with his mother. By then, Daniel's mental state had deteriorated significantly. He was soon diagnosed with schizophrenia and prescribed medication. However, he rarely took it as directed. Instead, he mixed it with alcohol, leading to violent and unpredictable behavior. In July 1991, a heated argument with his mother escalated into something unimaginable. In a sudden, frenzied attack, Daniel grabbed a knife and stabbed her nearly 30 times. She died before help could arrive. At his trial, he claimed he had been hearing voices, an argument that could have led to an insanity defense. However, psychiatric evaluations determined that Daniel had been fully aware of his actions. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. Despite being sentenced to 20 years, Daniel was released on parole in 2006, serving significantly less time than expected. While incarcerated, he had begun exchanging letters with Jennifer. Over time, their correspondence developed into a romantic relationship. Jennifer remained devoted to him, waiting patiently for his release. As soon as he was paroled, the two married, and Daniel moved into her home in Graham, a small, quiet town. However, in moving states, Daniel had violated the terms of his parole. He should have been arrested immediately, but a mix of bureaucratic failures and police negligence allowed him to slip through the system unnoticed. A clerical error resulted in his fingerprints being erased from law enforcement databases, effectively making him invisible to authorities. This mistake would prove crucial. Even after investigators found a bloody handprint at the mock's crime scene, there was no immediate match in any records. Further digging revealed another troubling detail. Daniel had briefly worked for the construction company that had purchased the rare work boots linked to the murder. Despite this, detectives lacked direct evidence to arrest him. They needed a solid case before making their move. On November 24, 2007, detectives invited Daniel to the police station under the pretense of helping create composite sketches of potential suspects. Eager to cooperate, he agreed, spending nearly an hour assisting in the creation of completely fabricated portraits. As he focused on the sketches, an officer casually entered the room and mentioned that they needed to take Daniel's fingerprints just to rule him out. For the first time, Daniel hesitated, but after a brief pause, he relented, certain that there was no way his prints could still be tied to the crime scene. Moments later, another officer offhandedly mentioned a key discovery: the bloody handprint found inside the mock's home. Daniel tensed. His expression shifted as he nervously explained that he had visited the mock's home in the past, meaning his fingerprints could be there. The officer reassured him that there was no reason to worry. After all, the handprint was in blood, meaning it had been left by the killer. At that moment, a second detective steered the conversation toward Daniel's past, bringing up the crime for which he had been imprisoned. When asked, Daniel admitted to killing his mother. But what happened next stunned investigators. Instead of expressing remorse, Daniel recounted the murder in chilling detail. He smiled as he described the attack, showing an eerie detachment. His tone was almost boastful, like someone reliving a proud accomplishment. While he rambled, forensic analysts completed their work. The bloody handprint from the crime scene was an exact match to Daniel Tavares. Detectives confronted him with the evidence. The smugness vanished from his face in an instant. His hands clenched into fists, his eyes dark with rage. But before he could react, officers restrained him and placed him under arrest. Faced with undeniable proof, Daniel knew he had no way out. He finally admitted to what had happened that morning. The previous night, he had spent hours at a bar, drinking heavily and using drugs. By the time he had run out of money, he was belligerent and aggressive. The bar staff threw him out, threatening to call the police if he caused further trouble. Furious and humiliated, Daniel fixated on an absurd thought. Brian owed him money. A month earlier, Daniel had given Brian a tattoo as a friendly favor. But now, in his intoxicated state, he convinced himself that Brian had taken advantage of him. He decided he was owed $50 for the work and that he would collect it, no matter what. At 5 a.m., still seething, Daniel grabbed his revolver and walked over to the mock's house. When Brian answered the door, he was groggy and irritated at being woken so early. Daniel immediately demanded payment for the tattoo. Confused, Brian refused, telling Daniel to come back when he was sober. Daniel insisted. Not wanting to argue, Brian sighed and turned toward the bedroom to grab some cash, hoping it would make Daniel leave. But as he walked away, he made an offhand remark, one that Daniel perceived as an insult. Enraged, Daniel pulled out his gun and shot Brian 3 times in the back. The gunfire woke Beverly, who rushed out of the bedroom to find her husband lying motionless on the floor, blood pooling beneath him. She froze, locking eyes with Daniel, who still held the smoking revolver. Realizing the danger, she turned to flee, but she only made it a few steps before 3 bullets struck her from behind. Once the horrific act was done, Daniel panicked. He ran home, waking his wife, Jennifer, but instead of reacting with shock or horror, Jennifer barely flinched. Without hesitation, she agreed to help him cover up the crime. Together, they returned to the mock's house. Jennifer helped move Beverly's body into the living room, placing her beside Brian. She then grabbed a blanket and covered them both. She was also the one who suggested using a broom to erase the bloody footprints. She meticulously wiped down every surface, ensuring that no obvious prints were left behind. But she missed one. When the cleanup was done, Daniel disposed of the murder weapon, throwing it into a nearby river. Despite extensive searches, the gun was never recovered. With his confession and forensic evidence stacked against him, Daniel had no hope of freedom. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Jennifer, claiming she had only helped out of fear, cooperated fully with investigators. She was sentenced to 1 year in prison for tampering with evidence. The case seemed closed, but Daniel Tabar's dark history was far from over. Years later, in 2015, the past resurfaced in a horrifying way. New homeowners had purchased the house where Daniel had once lived with his mother. During renovations, they began digging up the backyard. Buried deep in the soil, they unearthed human remains. Forensic analysis confirmed what detectives had feared. The bones belonged to a young woman who had gone missing in 1990. As investigators pieced the story together, a disturbing truth emerged. Daniel had known the woman. She had been a neighbor. He had been interested in her. But when she rejected his advances, he reacted with lethal violence. Rather than risk getting caught, he had buried her in his mother's backyard, where her body remained hidden for decades. The new evidence led to Daniel receiving a second life sentence. It was now clear Daniel Tabar's had always been a predator, lurking in the shadows. And for years, he had managed to escape justice. Until at last, the truth caught up with him. Case 4. On the night of August 5, 2002, the quiet town of Troop, Texas was settling in for another peaceful evening. Porch lights flickered, families rested, and nothing seemed out of the ordinary. But inside the parsonage of the local Methodist church, something terrible was happening. A frantic knock on a neighbor's door broke the silence. Standing there was Pastor Mike Tabb, holding his two young children, his face pale and his hands shaking. He was out of breath, his voice urgent. Something was very wrong. Minutes later, police arrived at the scene. What they found inside the house stunned even the most experienced officers. The bedroom was in chaos. Broken picture frames, overturned furniture, and signs of a struggle everywhere. And in the middle of it all lay Marla Tabb, motionless on the floor. At first, it seemed like a home invasion gone wrong, but as investigators looked closer, things didn't add up. The loving wife, the respected pastor, the peaceful town, none of it fit with what had just happened. So what really went on that night? And who was responsible? Marla Tabb was born on April the 25th, 1967, in Beaumont, Texas. She was one of two daughters born to Jim and his wife, whose name remains unknown. As was common in those times, her mother lovingly took care of the children and managed the household, while Jim, fulfilling his role as a devoted father, worked hard to provide financial stability for the family. Their daughters, Melanie and Marla, grew up in a home filled with music and the arts, which played a significant role in shaping their interests. From an early age, Marla displayed a deep passion for music and was eager to develop her talents. By the age of 11, she had fully embraced her Christian faith, becoming actively involved in the Methodist Church. She dedicated herself to the church's social outreach programs, spreading God's message to different communities, and encouraging people to strengthen their connection with the faith. It was during this time that her exceptional voice began to gain recognition. Accompanied by either a piano or a guitar, her singing touched the hearts of many. Beyond her talent, Marla possessed striking beauty and a charismatic personality that left a lasting impression on everyone who met her. Friends described her as kind-hearted and principled, someone who formed strong bonds and maintained them despite time and distance. She was deeply respected and never found herself in troublesome company or situations. Recognizing her passion, her supportive parents encouraged her to pursue formal music education. They enrolled her in a prestigious private university in Texas, where she flourished, gaining a deeper understanding of her craft. Marla remained devoted to her faith, using her musical gifts to serve the church. She eventually became the director of music and youth ministry, leading worship with her powerful soprano voice. For 3 seasons, she played a key role in organizing the church's musical productions across Texas. Raised in a household where faith guided every aspect of life, Marla had always dreamed of building a family of her own, one rooted in love and devotion to God. This dream started to take shape when she met Mike Tabb. Mike was born in Texas on July 7, 1961, to Eleanor and Harold Tabb. He grew up alongside his 2 brothers, Jeff and Danny, in a family that was deeply committed to the Methodist Church. When Mike decided to dedicate his life to ministry, his family saw it as a true blessing. After completing his studies at a Methodist Christian school, Mike was assigned as a chaplain at a military camp in North Carolina. Meanwhile, Marla continued to serve actively in her church. Their paths crossed often. She led the worship music, and he delivered the sermons. Over time, a strong friendship blossomed, built on mutual admiration and shared faith. This connection soon deepened into a loving and respectful relationship. As their love grew, Mike knew he wanted to spend his life with Marla. A few months into their courtship, he visited her parents to formally ask for her hand in marriage. With their blessing, he presented Marla with an engagement ring, marking the beginning of their journey toward marriage. In 1998, they exchanged vows in a Methodist church, pledging to love, respect, and support each other in all circumstances, always guided by their faith. At 31 and 37 years old respectively, Marla and Mike started their married life together, settling at the military camp where Mike continued his pastoral duties. Mike quickly gained a reputation as a powerful preacher, capable of moving even the most skeptical hearts. His sermons had an undeniable impact, inspiring people to turn to God. Many viewed him as a devoted disciple of Christ, committed to spreading the gospel. Marla, now known as Marla Tabb, became his steadfast partner in ministry. Aware of the responsibilities that came with this role, she dedicated herself wholeheartedly to supporting him and their mission. 2 years into their marriage, Marla received the joyful news that she was expecting their first child. On April 25, 2000, they welcomed a baby boy named Jonathan. His arrival brought immense happiness, and Marla devoted herself to raising him, while Mike continued his work as a minister. However, as Mike's reputation as a preacher grew, so did the demands on his time. He was frequently invited to speak at churches across the country, leading to extended absences from home. Marla, now a young mother, found it increasingly difficult to cope with his constant travels. She longed for his presence, feeling the strain of raising their child largely on her own. Their once unshakable harmony began to face its first true challenge. Despite her husband's frequent absences, Marla found some comfort in the security of the military camp, where she had built strong friendships and enjoyed a supportive environment. However, during this time, she suffered a heartbreaking loss. She became pregnant again, but miscarried shortly after. Juggling the demands of motherhood with the emotional toll of a failed pregnancy, Marla found it increasingly difficult to cope with Mike's prolonged absences. Their relationship became strained as disagreements escalated. While she longed for him to be more present, Mike insisted that his commitments required frequent travel. Despite their struggles, the couple attempted to mend their relationship, and by 2002, things seemed to be improving when Marla announced she was expecting another child. This news temporarily brought a sense of peace to their home, but their relief was short-lived. Unexpectedly, Mike received news that he was being discharged from military service and reassigned to a civilian Methodist church. With little time to process the sudden change, he was transferred to Troop, a small agricultural town in Texas, with a population of just 1,900. The timing could not have been worse. Marla was nearing the end of her pregnancy, already caring for their 2-year-old son, and now faced an abrupt move. Despite her reluctance, the transition had to be made quickly. The arrival of the new pastor and his family was a major event for the tight-knit community. Aware of Marla's advanced pregnancy, the women of the church took it upon themselves to prepare the parsonage for the family's arrival. However, overwhelmed by the recent upheaval, Marla struggled to adjust. She did not express gratitude in the way the congregation expected, which led to whispers about her being distant and unapproachable. Adjusting to civilian life proved to be a significant challenge. The shift from the structure of military ministry to a small-town congregation, coupled with financial uncertainties and the stress of their growing family, put additional strain on their marriage. Both Marla and Mike felt the pressure of being scrutinized by the congregation, whose members closely observed their every move. As tensions mounted, Marla found herself the subject of town gossip. One particular incident cemented her reputation among the townspeople. In a moment of frustration, she publicly confronted Mike, which was seen as a sign of disrespect. In this conservative rural community, where traditional gender roles were deeply ingrained, Marla's assertiveness was viewed as unacceptable. From that moment, many labeled her as a domineering wife who mistreated her husband. Marla, increasingly unhappy, began to confide in trusted friends and family about her struggles. She questioned whether the life she was living bore any resemblance to the Christian home she had once dreamed of. The stress took a toll on her health, and when labor complications arose, she was rushed to the hospital for an emergency C-section. On July 25, 2002, she gave birth to a baby boy. Jonathan, now 2 years old, was thrilled to have a little brother to look after. Marla took time to recover, and once she regained her strength, she attempted to reconnect with the community and resume her role as the pastor's wife. However, she never fully adapted to her new surroundings. The difficulties of the past months had left deep scars, and the strain in her marriage continued to grow, affecting the atmosphere at home. Like any couple facing hardships, they could have worked through their differences or chosen an amicable separation. However, what happened next shattered any possibility of resolution in the most tragic way imaginable. On the night of August 5, 2002, the police received a frantic 911 call, redirected from emergency dispatch. The caller was a neighbor of the Tabb family, who reported that Pastor Mike had arrived at their doorstep in distress, carrying his 2 young children and begging for help. His wife had been brutally attacked and was unresponsive. Emergency responders, including sheriff's deputies and firefighters, rushed to the parsonage. The scene that awaited them was devastating. Marla, just 6 weeks postpartum, had been found in her bedroom, still dressed in her nightclothes. Even the most seasoned officers were shaken by the brutality of what they saw. The crime scene was in complete disarray. Broken picture frames, overturned furniture, and scattered belongings indicated a violent struggle. Investigators immediately began gathering evidence, while others questioned Mike about the events of that evening. He claimed that he had just arrived home, only to find the front door open and his wife lying motionless on the floor. Checking for a pulse and finding none, he had rushed to the children's room, grabbed both boys, and fled to the neighbor's house for help. Marla's body was transported to the morgue for autopsy. Initial observations were grim. Her face was severely disfigured and her jaw was fractured. A forceful blow to the head appeared to have been the fatal injury. As investigators worked to determine the murder weapon, one comment from Mike stood out. Without being prompted, he speculated that his wife had been attacked with a baseball bat, a detail that raised immediate suspicion as the authorities had not yet determined the cause of death. Detectives pursued various leads, initially considering the possibility of a home invasion gone wrong. However, this theory was quickly dismissed as nothing of value was missing from the home. Another possibility emerged, a crime of passion. With no clear suspect, investigators remained open to all possibilities. That night, Mike was asked to take his children somewhere safe, and they were temporarily placed in the care of their paternal grandparents. Law enforcement then requested his clothing and shoes for examination and questioned him about his whereabouts earlier that evening. He stated that he had taken his 2-year-old son to his parents' house, a claim they later confirmed. In a town where violent crime was nearly unheard of, the last recorded homicide had been 5 years earlier. News of Marla's brutal death spread rapidly. The entire community was horrified by the nature of the attack, and many sympathized with Mike, who now faced raising 2 small children alone. When the preliminary autopsy report was released, it confirmed that Marla had died from blunt force trauma to the head. Her jaw had been fractured in multiple places, further indicating the extreme violence of the attack. Marla's funeral was held in an intimate ceremony where a fellow minister spoke about her unwavering faith and dedication to God. Though her death was a profound loss for those who loved her, the sermon framed it as a transition to eternal peace. Throughout the services, Mike was visibly grief-stricken, his sorrow deeply moving those in attendance. Meanwhile, investigators continued speaking with those close to Marla, hoping to uncover any clues that might shed light on the case. A breakthrough came when they interviewed Melanie. Fighting back tears, she revealed that her sister had confided in her just weeks before her death, expressing deep distress over her crumbling marriage. Marla had stumbled upon something unexpected, a promotional flyer for an exotic dance club tucked into the pocket of Mike's pants. When she confronted him, he claimed it belonged to a congregation member he had been counseling, but Marla wasn't convinced. As she dug deeper, she discovered a troubling pattern. The church-related trips Mike frequently took were not for ministry work, as he had claimed, but rather opportunities to indulge in a secret life that contradicted everything he preached. Investigators followed this lead and uncovered 2 separate P.O. boxes, one in Troop and another in North Carolina, where the couple had previously lived. These hidden mailboxes had allowed Mike to keep his double life concealed from his family. Determined to gather concrete evidence supporting their theory that Marla had been killed because she intended to divorce Mike and expose his deception, authorities placed him under covert surveillance. They suspected he would soon reveal his true nature, and they were right. Mike was frequently seen visiting illicit establishments, including escort services and strip clubs, where he often drank heavily. Just days after Marla's funeral, he was spotted entering an exclusive club known for catering to high-profile clientele. Investigators pressed on with their inquiries, leading to the discovery of what they believed to be the murder weapon. While the crime scene had been meticulously cleaned, one crucial detail had been overlooked, a large wooden table missing one of its legs. Forensic tests using luminol revealed traces of Marla's blood inside the trunk of Mike's vehicle, as well as on his shoes, including the laces. With this irrefutable evidence in hand, law enforcement worked swiftly with the district attorney's office to secure an arrest warrant. On August 8, 2002, the quiet town of Troop was shaken once again when news broke that their respected Methodist pastor had been arrested as the prime suspect in his wife's murder. However, his time behind bars was brief. He was released the same day after posting a $50,000 bail. Mike's legal team had already begun negotiations with the court, arranging for his preliminary hearing to take place in mid-August. A plea deal was in the works that would allow him to avoid a lengthy trial in exchange for a 50-year prison sentence. But when the hearing date arrived, Mike was nowhere to be found. Authorities soon discovered he had attempted to take his own life. His defense attorneys claimed he was hospitalized, but prosecutors argued that this was an attempt to escape justice and demanded additional penalties. According to his family, Mike had been staying at his parents' house in the days leading up to the hearing. One afternoon, he went for a walk and never returned. Concerned, his family alerted authorities, who launched a search. He was found near a lake with a self-inflicted stab wound. The injury was severe enough to require immediate surgery, which lasted nearly 3 hours. During the investigation, a witness came forward, stating they had seen Mike hiding behind a tree and throwing an object into the water. A team of divers was deployed, and after searching the murky depths, they recovered a knife believed to have been used in the attempt on his own life. Given these events, prosecutors sought to extend his prison sentence from 50 to 55 years, while a judge increased his bail to $1 million. On September 29, 2003, Mike appeared before the district court, showing no visible emotion as he formally accepted the prosecution's plea deal. His defense attorney told reporters that they had chosen to avoid a full trial, as it would bring to light painful details that neither Marla's nor Mike's family wanted exposed. The attorney acknowledged that Mike had taken Marla's life, but suggested that the exact motive would remain unknown. He claimed that Mike's primary concern was protecting his children from ever hearing the grim details of their mother's death. However, that hope proved futile. The case had drawn widespread media attention, and the tragic circumstances surrounding Marla's murder became impossible to keep hidden. Before the judge delivered the final sentence, Melanie took the stand to deliver a victim impact statement on behalf of the family. Her voice trembled with emotion as she addressed Mike directly, reminding him that he had orphaned his own children. She demanded that he take responsibility to stand before the court and admit that it was his own hands that had stolen their mother from them. The judge then issued the final ruling. Mike Tabb was sentenced to 55 years in prison for the murder of Marla Tabb. Prosecutors clarified that under Texas law, he would not be eligible for parole until he had served at least 27.5 years behind bars. Throughout the proceedings, Mike remained silent and emotionless. Reports later surfaced that he had attempted to end his life multiple times while incarcerated. Despite receiving psychological treatment, his internal torment never subsided. Analysts speculated that the immense guilt weighed heavily on him, perhaps a lingering consequence of his past as a preacher who once stood before a congregation preaching about morality and faith. The final piece of information uncovered during this investigation revealed that Mike ultimately served only 20 years of his sentence. He died in 2023. His name was inscribed on a headstone in a Texas cemetery with no mention of his date of death. No official statement was released regarding the cause. Ironically, his family listed Marla as his spouse in his memorial records. His tombstone bore the epitaph "Loving Son." Perhaps Mike truly had been a devoted son, known for his affection toward his parents. But in the end, his selfishness and hidden desires robbed his kids of a father they could admire. More tragically, he deprived Marla of the chance to see her sons grow into men, a future she had once envisioned as a faithful wife and mother, now stolen by the very person who had vowed to love and protect her. Case 5. A 911 call came in about a woman lying at the bottom of a staircase outside an apartment complex. At first, it looked like a terrible accident. Maybe she tripped and fell. Her purse, keys, and wallet were scattered around her, but nothing seemed stolen. Even her money was still there, so it didn't look like a robbery. But something felt off. When first responders arrived, they quickly realized this wasn't just a simple fall. And when detectives took a closer look, they found something shocking. Something that turned this from an accident into a full-blown murder investigation. So what really happened to Danita Smith, and who wanted her dead? Danita Smith was born on November 10, 1981, in New Bern, North Carolina. She was the pride and joy of her parents, Dale and Laverne Smith, who adored her deeply. Growing up in a lively household alongside her 3 siblings, Derek, Darius, and Danielle, Danita's energy and enthusiasm for life were impossible to ignore. Even from a young age, she had an undeniable presence that made her stand out. Friends and family often described Danita as someone who could light up any room. Her warmth, kindness, and infectious smile made her unforgettable. Anyone who met her would quickly realize she had a natural ability to bring joy to those around her. Looking at her photos, it was clear her happiness radiated through every image, capturing the essence of someone who truly embraced life. Academically, Danita was a dedicated and hardworking student. Her teachers praised her commitment to excellence, and her efforts paid off when she graduated high school with honors. She then pursued higher education at North Carolina Central University, initially majoring in English. However, during her college years, Danita discovered a newfound passion, photojournalism. She became deeply fascinated by the power of visual storytelling and the way a single photograph could evoke emotions and tell compelling narratives. With her characteristic determination, she pursued this passion and quickly earned it for her exceptional photography skills. In her personal life, Danita found happiness with her fiancé, Jeremiah Stroud, a young police officer from Greensboro, North Carolina. The two met in college and built a strong relationship over 6 years before Jeremiah proposed. For Danita, their engagement marked the beginning of an exciting new chapter, one filled with dreams of marriage, career success, and building a future together. However, there was one challenge they faced: distance. After graduating in 2004, Jeremiah moved to Greensboro for his job as a police officer, while Danita remained in Durham. Though only about an hour apart, their separation meant they couldn't see each other daily, making their relationship more reliant on weekend visits. Unfortunately, the physical distance may have created an emotional gap as well. Unbeknownst to Danita, Jeremiah had become involved with a colleague, Shannon Crawley, a 911 dispatcher, and a single mother of 2. On the morning of January 4, 2007, just after 10 a.m., a frantic 911 call came in from a male resident of Durham, North Carolina. He reported an alarming scene outside an apartment complex, a woman lying motionless at the bottom of the stairs, surrounded by blood. When first responders arrived at the scene, it was already too late. The woman on the ground was unresponsive, just as the caller had feared. Moments later, authorities confirmed the victim's identity. It was Danita Smith. Detective Sean Pate, from the Durham Police Department, took charge of the investigation, arriving at the scene to assess the situation. At first glance, it appeared that Danita had suffered a tragic fall. Her personal belongings, keys, purse, and wallet, were scattered around her, reinforcing the idea that she might have lost her balance. As officers examined her possessions, they noticed something unusual. Her wallet still contained a significant amount of cash. If this had been a robbery, it was unlikely the perpetrator would have left the money behind. This led investigators to question whether theft had anything to do with Danita's death. No cameras had captured what had transpired. However, as authorities took a closer look at Danita's body, it became clear that she had not simply fallen. She had been murdered. A fatal gunshot wound to the head was discovered. Her body's position had initially concealed the wound, leading to the assumption that she had simply fallen down the stairs. With this shocking revelation, law enforcement immediately began canvassing the area for witnesses. The apartment complex, which primarily housed students, was usually bustling with activity. However, due to the holiday season, fewer residents were around. Despite this, officers managed to locate a few individuals who had seen something suspicious. The most valuable testimony came from the complex's maintenance director. He told investigators that he had seen a woman fleeing the scene around the time of the incident. She was described as tall, black woman with a fair complexion, driving a burgundy SUV. This key detail raised immediate suspicions. Could this woman be connected to Danita's murder? Interestingly, the maintenance director had not only seen the woman, he had spoken with her. He heard a gunshot and noticed the woman appeared visibly shaken. When he asked if she had heard the gunfire, she admitted that she had and seemed extremely upset. He even suggested that she meet him at another location so they could report the incident to the police together. Instead, she left the scene. Though the maintenance worker eventually called 911, his call was not the one that initially brought first responders to the complex. In fact, a separate 911 call had been made about an hour earlier, but when officers arrived, they found nothing unusual. No body, no evidence of a shooting. How was this possible? Had Danita's body somehow gone unnoticed? The apartment complex was large, but it seemed odd that the first response team had missed such a critical discovery. As news of Danita's death spread, her loved ones rushed to the scene. Among them was her fiancé, Jeremiah. Upon arrival, he sought out Detective Pate, eager to speak with him. As is standard in homicide investigations, authorities looked closely at the victim's significant other. When asked about his whereabouts that morning, Jeremiah stated that he had been at home, sleeping after working late the night before. However, he had no one to corroborate his alibi. While it wasn't the strongest defense, police were still gathering information, so they noted his statement and allowed him to leave. After spending some time with Danita's family, Jeremiah headed home. But the next day, investigators reached out again with additional questions. One key inquiry stood out. Did Germara know anyone who drove a burgundy SUV? His response changed everything. Without hesitation, he provided a name, Shannon Crawley. The revelation immediately shifted the focus of the investigation. Initially, there had been speculation that Germara himself could have been involved, but now another person had entered the picture. When questioned further, Germara admitted that he had been involved in an affair with Shannon. He stated that their romantic relationship had ended nearly a year earlier, calling it a mistake. According to him, their relationship had come to a breaking point when Shannon became pregnant in 2005. They ultimately decided on an abortion, which signaled the end of their romance, at least from his perspective. While he insisted their relationship had ended, Shannon had remained in his life. Though no longer romantically involved, the two still spoke frequently. According to him, they had a strong friendship, but nothing more. However, it became apparent that Shannon may not have seen things the same way. Even after their breakup, Shannon continued to maintain a presence in Germara's life. She started attending his church, something he initially dismissed as coincidence. Then she purchased a home near his, which he also brushed off, assuming she had simply chosen a desirable area. But as investigators pieced together the timeline, it became clear that Shannon's attachment to Germara had never truly faded. According to Germara, Danita and Shannon had never crossed paths. However, as he spoke to investigators, he admitted something unsettling. He now believed Shannon had been stalking him for quite some time. Though he hadn't realized it before, certain details were starting to click into place. He emphasized once again that he had been the one to end their relationship. Then came another critical detail. The last time he had seen Shannon was on Christmas Eve of 2006, less than 2 weeks before Danita's murder. That night, he walked into church, proudly escorting his fiancée, Danita, by his side. Shannon was there. Her reaction was one of complete shock. She had no idea that Germara was engaged, perhaps not even that he was in a relationship at all. Up until that moment, Shannon may have believed that they were on the verge of rekindling their romance. But now, she was faced with the undeniable truth. Germara had moved on, and not only that, he was about to marry someone else. Investigators now had enough reason to speak directly with Shannon. They visited her workplace to question her about her whereabouts on the morning of the murder. Shannon claimed she had been at home caring for her sick child. She openly admitted to having a past relationship with Germara, making no attempt to hide their history. However, her version of events differed significantly from what Germara had told police. According to Shannon, their relationship had ended because she didn't want to have children. This contradicted Germara's claim that their relationship ended when she became pregnant and had an abortion. When asked whether she knew Danita, Shannon stated that she had never met her. She explained that she believed Danita was Germara's ex-girlfriend. But given what investigators now knew, this response raised suspicions. It seemed likely that Germara had kept his two lives completely separate, leading Shannon to believe she was the only woman in his life. The next question was crucial. Did Shannon own a firearm? She answered no. However, investigators soon discovered that she was lying. A new witness came forward, Ronald Simpson, a co-worker of Shannon's. Simpson revealed that Shannon had purchased a revolver from him in October 2006. This revelation was damning. The firearm matched the caliber of the gun used in Danita's murder. Not only had Shannon lied about owning a weapon, but she had purchased it just months before Danita was killed. Meanwhile, detectives examined phone records from both Shannon and Germara. Germara's records indicated that his phone had been in his home during the time of the murder, aligning with his alibi. Of course, this didn't completely clear him. Someone else could have been using his phone while he was elsewhere, but it was a promising lead in his favor. Shannon's phone, however, told a very different story. Despite her claim that she had been home all morning, cell tower data placed her in Durham, approximately 60 miles from where she was supposed to be. This put her near the crime scene at the time of the murder. When confronted, Shannon continued to insist she hadn't been in Durham that day, but the evidence was stacking up against her. Police then seized Shannon's burgundy SUV and ran forensic tests. Their primary focus was detecting any traces of gunshot residue. The results were conclusive. Gunshot residue was found on the steering wheel. This meant that at some point Shannon had likely fired a weapon and then driven her vehicle. The presence of the residue on the steering wheel strongly suggested she had done so just before or after getting behind the wheel. One final piece of the puzzle remained, the witness testimony from the maintenance worker who had spoken to the woman fleeing the scene. Though there was no official record of a lineup, The man had consistently described the suspect as a tall black woman with a fair complexion, driving a burgundy SUV, and that description matched Shannon Crawley perfectly. On January 9, 2007, Shannon was taken into custody and formally charged with the murder of Danita Smith. Surprisingly, despite the serious nature of the charges, Shannon was released shortly after on a $100,000 bond. She had no prior criminal history, which likely played a role in the court's decision. Additionally, as a 9-to-11 dispatcher and the sole caretaker of her 2 young children, she fit the profile of someone who might receive leniency, especially when it came to setting bail. But Shannon wasn't content to wait for trial. In May 2007, just a few months after her arrest, she and her attorney made an unexpected move. They voluntarily walked into the Durham Police Department to present their own version of events. What she told them completely flipped the narrative. Shannon now claimed that Jermier had been the one stalking her after their breakup. She alleged that he frequently called her, showed up at her workplace unannounced, and made her feel unsafe. According to Shannon, a concerned coworker had even offered her a gun for protection, knowing that Jermier carried a firearm as a police officer. She admitted to taking the weapon, but insisted she regretted the decision and disposed of it soon after. Then she dropped a bombshell. Shannon told police that on the morning of Danita's murder, Jermier had forced her into her own vehicle at gunpoint. She claimed he made her drive to an unfamiliar apartment complex, Danita's residence, where he took her phone and keys before stepping out of the car. She described waiting in the car for a long period, unsure of what was happening, until she suddenly heard shouting. She couldn't make out the words, but she recognized Jermier's voice arguing with a woman. Moments later, a gunshot rang out. According to Shannon, Jermier sprinted back to the car in a panic and ordered her to drive. She said he climbed into the back seat, crouching down on the floor while urging her to leave as quickly as possible. She also claimed this was when she encountered the maintenance worker. In her version of events, she briefly stopped, hoping he would recognize that she was in distress, but she ultimately drove away because Jermier had his gun pressed to her back. However, there were immediate problems with her story. First, how did she explain the gunshot residue found on the steering wheel of her car? She told police that at some point during their escape, Jermier had grabbed the wheel while moving from the front seat to the back, leaving behind residue. Second, why was her phone detected near the crime scene when she claimed she had never been there? She had no reasonable explanation for this. Investigators wasted no time confronting Jermier with Shannon's claims. He vehemently denied every accusation, maintaining that he had been at home during the time of the murder. His cell phone records supported this, though they weren't definitive proof. After all, someone could have used his phone to establish an alibi. Meanwhile, Shannon remained free on bond. She received permission to relocate to Charlotte, about 100 miles away, so she could live with her family. But even that wasn't the end of the drama. In June 2008, Shannon made yet another shocking allegation, this time accusing Jermier of attacking her. According to Shannon, she had been out walking her dog early in the morning when Jermier suddenly appeared outside her family's home. She claimed he assaulted her at knife point and held her captive for several hours, subjecting her to sexual violence. The police immediately launched an investigation, and what they found completely discredited her claim. A medical examination revealed no evidence of sexual assault. More importantly, surveillance footage confirmed that Jermier had been nowhere near Shannon that morning. He was accounted for in his hometown, making it physically impossible for him to have been at the scene of the alleged attack. With her accusation completely disproven, police concluded that Shannon had fabricated the entire story. Despite this, Shannon remained out on bond for nearly 2 more years before her case finally went to trial. On February 8, 2010, the trial began. The prosecution argued that Shannon had become obsessed with Jermier and saw Danita as an obstacle standing in the way of her future with him. Her motive, they claimed, was fueled by jealousy and a desperate desire to remove the competition. Meanwhile, the defense maintained that Shannon was being set up, that the real perpetrator was none other than Jermier himself. However, she never provided a specific reason why he would have done it. Instead, she repeatedly described him as violent and controlling, painting a picture of a man who was dangerous and unpredictable. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury would hear about Shannon's past false allegations against Jermier, including the rape accusation that had been thoroughly disproven. Her legal team fought aggressively to keep this out of the trial, but they lost. The court allowed the jury to consider the fact that she had made false claims in the past, a devastating blow to her credibility. Jermier took the stand as the prosecution's star witness. He spoke about his relationship with Shannon, their breakup, and the troubling behavior she displayed afterward. He was well-spoken and presented himself as composed and credible. However, when it was the defense's turn to cross-examine, they made sure to highlight one critical flaw. Jermier had spent years deceiving both Shannon and Danita. Then, the prosecution introduced a crucial piece of forensic evidence, the bullet fragment recovered from Danita's body. While the murder weapon itself had never been found, forensic experts confirmed that the bullet matched the type of gun Shannon had purchased just months before the crime. Shannon also took the stand. She repeated the same story she had told police, insisting that Jermier had forced her to accompany him to Danita's apartment, that she had no idea what was happening, and that she was merely an unwilling participant. She delivered her testimony with confidence, never wavering under questioning. For a moment, it seemed like she was holding her own. Then the prosecution revealed what would be her undoing: tape recordings. Shannon had secretly recorded conversations with Jermier after Danita's murder, supposedly in an effort to get him to confess. These tapes had been provided to her defense team, but they had chosen not to use them. That alone was suspicious. The prosecution, however, had no reservations about playing the recordings in court. In the recordings, Shannon could be heard questioning Jermier about what had happened. At one point, he asked who she had been talking to. She denied speaking to anyone, but he continued to press her. Then, he issued what seemed to be a chilling threat, warning that if she kept talking, he would find her. The voice on the recordings sounded unusually high-pitched, nothing like Jermier's natural speaking voice. The prosecution seized the opportunity, pointing out the discrepancy. Even Danita's friends and family, who knew Jermier well, testified that the voice on the tape didn't sound like him at all. The implication was clear. Shannon had staged the recordings. The prosecution suggested that she had hired someone to impersonate Jermier, trying to fabricate evidence to shift the blame onto him. By this point, Shannon's credibility had been completely dismantled. In the end, the jury found Shannon Crawley guilty of Danita Smith's murder. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As for Jermier, he eventually left law enforcement and pursued a career in financial advising. He moved on with his life, getting married and starting a family. Yet, in the end, no outcome could undo the tragic loss of Danita Smith. By all accounts, she was a remarkable woman with a bright future. She had so much left to accomplish, so many dreams that would never come to fruition. But her memory remains alive, not only through the justice that was served, but in the hearts of her family and friends, who continue to honor her life. Case 6. Cleveland, Ohio, 2009. A gloomy autumn afternoon. The sky heavy with dark gray clouds, signaling an impending downpour over Mount Pleasant. This wasn't a luxurious or glamorous place. Old buildings, alleys filled with trash, rundown apartment complexes, all painting a bleak picture of a neighborhood abandoned by society. But the worst thing wasn't poverty or rampant crime. It was a mysterious putrid smell that had haunted residents for months. At first, people thought the stench came from a nearby garbage dump or a dead animal trapped in the sewer system. But as time passed, the smell grew stronger, spreading to the point where those living nearby couldn't stand it anymore. People shut their windows, lit scented candles, sprayed perfume, but nothing could mask that terrifying odor of death. Then one day, the stench was no longer the only thing that terrified the residents. While everyone was still debating the source of the unbearable smell, at least 11 women in Cleveland had mysteriously disappeared. They were all black and impoverished, most of them either homeless or living alone, many with a history of alcohol and drug abuse. People like them vanished every day. No one searched for them. No one remembered them. That's why local police paid little attention when they were reported missing. But on the afternoon of October 29, 2009, everything changed. That afternoon, Cleveland police received an emergency call. A woman, in a state of panic, ran into the police station with bruises on her neck and a horrifying story. She said she had just escaped from the house at 12:05, where a man had held her captive and tried to kill her. And the strange man living inside that house was none other than Anthony Soule. On the corner of Imperial Avenue, 12205, stood silently among a row of dilapidated houses. There was nothing special about it. A two-story house with peeling paint, windows tightly covered by curtains, and a front yard littered with piles of trash. To the neighbors, the homeowner led an eerily secretive life. Day or night, the house was almost always shut tight. Every night, the surrounding neighbors often heard strange noises, screams, thuds, but then everything would go silent, as if nothing had ever happened. No one knew exactly what Anthony Soule was doing in there. Everyone felt something was off, but no one did anything. In Mount Pleasant, people learned to mind their own business, so they chose to ignore the disturbing signs surrounding Soule's house. Only when blaring sirens and a fleet of police cars arrived at his doorstep did the residents realize that all their suspicions were true. After receiving the distress call, police immediately headed to the house on Imperial Avenue. When they arrived, the door was still shut, just like always, but this time, they had a search warrant. A young officer, just 3 years into the force, was the first to step inside. The moment the door opened, he immediately recoiled, vomiting right on the doorstep. The stench coming from inside was unlike anything he had ever smelled before, a horrifying blend of decomposing bodies, filth, and dried blood. No one could have prepared for what they were about to uncover inside Anthony Soule's house. The police had no idea they were about to walk into one of the most gruesome cases in Cleveland's history. Inside the house, darkness engulfed everything. The hallway lights no longer worked, with only faint slivers of light seeping in through the tightly covered windows. The living room was a chaotic mess. Trash, beer cans, cigarette butts, and old clothes strewn everywhere. But nothing was more horrifying than the thick, suffocating smell of death in the air, a pungent stench of decayed flesh and dried blood. The officers split up to search. One stepped into the kitchen, where black plastic bags were tied shut, bulging as if they contained something unspeakable. Another officer opened the door leading to the basement, and immediately, a swarm of thick, black flies burst out, carrying with them an unbearable stench that made the man double over, coughing violently. But that wasn't the worst thing the officers would face. When they entered the bedroom, a horrifying sight awaited them. On the floor lay a decomposing female body, her skin darkened, covered in swarming flies. Her eyes were wide open, as if death had come so suddenly that she hadn't even had time to close them. A scream rang out as another officer discovered 2 more bodies. One was stuffed beneath an old mattress, while the other lay in the corner of the room, tightly wrapped in a plastic bag. All 3 bodies were in an advanced state of decomposition, their stench overwhelming. This was no longer just a crime scene, it was a true graveyard. As soon as the police called for backup, an officer walking past the stairs accidentally kicked something soft. When he looked down, his face turned pale. It was a human arm, stripped down to the bone, the victim dismembered by someone. But even more horrifying secrets were hidden inside this house. The forensic team was called in, bringing high-powered flashlights. When they shone their lights down the basement stairs, the sight that appeared made everyone shudder. Stacks of black garbage bags were piled on top of one another, some gnawed open by rats, revealing patches of pale, decayed flesh inside. The police slowly opened one of the bags to investigate, and immediately, the overwhelming stench forced the entire team to step back. Inside was a victim's severed head, eyes wide open, hair matted with decomposition fluids, crawling with maggots. As they continued searching, the police uncovered even more horrifying evidence. In the basement, they found a long iron chain, seemingly used to restrain victims against the wall. When the forensic team entered Soule's bedroom, they had no idea they were about to step into one of the most terrifying rooms of all. The mattress was stained with dried blood, evidence of repeated killings. Under the bed, they found a human skeleton wrapped in a plastic bag, with rotting flesh still clinging to the bones. He had been sleeping on the very bed where he killed his victims. He lived among decomposing bodies, in a stench so unbearable that no one else could have tolerated it. A plastic container under the bed held various pieces of jewelry and wallets, later identified as belongings of the missing women. Finally, when police dug up the backyard, they discovered 2 shallow graves, each containing a different body. Some victims had been buried alive. During the house search, officers found old videotapes, which contained documentary footage of other serial killers. Soule didn't just kill, he studied, learned, and relished becoming a monster. Criminal psychologists began profiling Anthony Soule, and realized he didn't kill impulsively. He planned, carefully selected his victims, and turned his house into a living prison. The investigation wasn't over, but one thing was clear: Anthony Soule was a serial killer, and this house was a true hell on earth. According to police records, Anthony Soule had served 6 years in the U.S. Marine Corps, spending time in California, the Carolinas, and Japan. He moved into the white, three-story house at 12205 Imperial Avenue in 2005. It was a poor neighborhood on Cleveland's east side, where well-kept working-class homes stood alongside abandoned houses and shuttered businesses. The house had once belonged to his father, who had passed away, and Soul had bought it for a low price. Before moving there, he had served a 15-year prison sentence for rape. In 1989, prosecutors stated that Soul lured a woman to his former residence on Page Avenue, threatened to kill her, and sexually assaulted her. After being released from prison in 2005, Soul worked at a factory, but was laid off in 2007. When his unemployment benefits ran out, he started selling scrap metal. He had once been married and had a daughter, but after his release, he never attempted to reconnect with his ex-wife or child. Instead, he sought partners through an adult website. He created his account immediately after leaving prison in 2005, describing himself as 5 feet, 10 inches, 160 pounds, with a distinctive scar on his face. On his profile, he claimed to be a master looking for a submissive, portraying himself as outgoing and party-loving. From there, the butcher began his hunt. One night in December 2008, a woman ran into the middle of Kinsman Road and 116th Street. Waving frantically for help, her body covered in blood. The woman was Gladys Wade, 41 at the time. She frantically told police that Anthony Soul had invited her in for a beer when she was passing by on her way to a local convenience store. When she refused, Soul attacked her, dragged her upstairs, and strangled her until she lost consciousness. When she woke up, her clothes had been removed, and Soul was still choking her, attempting to assault her. Wade managed to escape, running into a nearby restaurant, begging people to call 911. But instead of helping, they told her to go outside and use a payphone. At that moment, Soul chased after her, angrily telling neighbors that she had tried to break into his house to steal. Then he calmly walked back inside. Wade finally found a police patrol car and pleaded for help. Officers called an ambulance and took her to the hospital. After receiving medical treatment, Wade gave a full statement to the police, but they dismissed it as a he said, she said situation. Officers claimed there was no clear evidence, and even suggested that Wade might have been the attacker instead. Police later went to check Soul's house on Imperial Avenue at the corner of 120 Threard Street. Snow tracks around the entrance indicated a struggle. A blood-stained tissue was discarded nearby, and the steps leading to the house were smeared with blood. At that point, they briefly detained Soul for questioning. 2 days later, police released Soul without searching his house, and at least 5 more women disappeared before his arrest in 2009. Wade's case became a missed opportunity, haunting the community and law enforcement for years to come. For a long time, he lured vulnerable women with sweet talk, sometimes with alcohol or drugs. Some victims who escaped reported him to the police, but no one took action. Others, less fortunate, never left that house alive. A day after the police raided the killer's house, authorities in the U.S. discovered 4 more bodies and a skull inside and around his Cleveland residence, bringing the total number of victims to 11. A serious issue emerged. Anthony Soul was not at the scene when police searched his house. The killer had vanished without a trace. An urgent manhunt was launched. Anthony Soul's name appeared on every news channel, and his image flooded the city. But Soul was no ordinary fugitive. He had military training, knew how to hide, and knew how to evade capture. For the next 3 days, he became the most wanted man in America. Cleveland was gripped with fear. Everyone knew a monster was lurking somewhere in the city. People locked their doors, and women were afraid to go out alone. Until October 31st, 2009, when a bar employee spotted Soul wandering near downtown and immediately called the police. 15 minutes later, a SWAT team moved in and arrested the killer on the street. When caught, Soul remained eerily calm. He denied being the man authorities were searching for. But when law enforcement began fingerprinting him, he finally admitted his identity. Soul was officially confirmed as the man behind the gruesome murders. Cleveland had never witnessed a case as horrifying as this. News of 12,205. Imperial Avenue spread like wildfire, shaking the entire city. But as police began releasing the victims' names, a bitter truth emerged. Most of them were women whom society had forgotten. Tanya Carmichael, 52, had been missing since 2008. Her mother reported her disappearance, but no one really paid attention. "Are you sure your daughter didn't just go somewhere and will come back?" an officer asked. Michelle Mason, 45, was an intelligent woman who had attended college but fell into addiction. When she disappeared, no one reported it because they assumed she's just wandering off again. The list went on, but the common thread among them was clear. They were the most easily overlooked members of society: black women, the homeless, and those with histories of addiction. After the case became public outrage erupted. Cleveland police faced harsh criticism for ignoring warnings for years. The victims' families began filing lawsuits against the city, raising troubling questions. Why didn't the police investigate the reports from women who had escaped? Why didn't they check the house sooner, despite neighbors constantly reporting the foul stench? How many other cases had been ignored simply because the victims were black, homeless, or struggling with addiction? Outside the Cuyahoga County Courthouse, a crowd gathered from early morning, holding pictures of the victims, signs demanding justice, and tears of anguish. Anthony Sowell, known as the Imperial Avenue Strangler, entered the courtroom wearing an orange prison jumpsuit, his hands tightly cuffed. He showed no fear, no remorse. His unnerving calmness sent chills through the room. His eyes scanned the crowd as if he were still in control. The judge, lawyers, victims' families, and media, all eyes were on him. The prosecutor opened with a sharp and chilling statement. Images from 12205 Imperial Avenue were displayed on a large screen. The courtroom air became thick with tension. One by one, witnesses took the stand. Sobs echoed throughout the room, not just for the victims, but for an entire city that had failed to protect its most vulnerable citizens. When it was Anthony Sowell's turn to speak, the room fell silent. He did not tremble, did not apologize. He even smirked when asked about his crimes. Sowell tilted his head, paused for a moment, then shrugged. What's done is done. Regret won't change anything. The courtroom erupted in fury. Some family members broke down in tears, while others were so enraged they wanted to lunge at him. His blatant indifference only fueled the city's collective outrage. After weeks of trial, the jury reached a verdict. Anthony Sowell was convicted on 82 counts, including murder, rape, kidnapping, and abuse of corpses. The judge announced the death sentence. The courtroom burst into emotion. Some families embraced, crying because justice had finally been served. But for many, justice had come too late. Sowell never faced execution. He spent years in prison, continuously filing appeals to delay his death. But on February 8, 2021, Anthony Sowell died in prison from cancer. There was no public execution, no final moment for the victims' families to see him punished. He passed away quietly, without suffering, completely unlike the pain he inflicted on his victims. Some felt it was unfair. Others believed his death was insignificant compared to the lessons this case left behind. A month after the case, 12205 Imperial Avenue was demolished. People said it was the only way to erase the lingering horrors of that place. In the winter of 2011, a massive bulldozer rolled into Mount Pleasant, heading for 1205 Imperial Avenue. Outside, a silent crowd gathered. Neighbors, victims' families, and even strangers who had followed the case from the beginning. It wasn't just a building being torn down. It was the destruction of a monument to pure evil. The Anthony Sowell case ended with a death sentence for the killer. But those who followed the story knew that some mysteries would never be solved. How many people had he really killed? Were their bodies still undiscovered? What had those women endured in their final moments? Some experts believed the 11 known victims were just the tip of the iceberg. How many more had Sowell murdered without anyone knowing? How many people had gone missing in Cleveland without anyone caring? And most importantly, if the police had investigated sooner, how many lives could have been saved? Case 7. A British millionaire and his Thai wife were found buried next to a duck pen on their family farm, shocking the community. Strangely, their assets remained intact, with the only missing item being a newly purchased pickup truck. Upon reviewing CCTV footage, police discovered two strangers breaking into the farm, one of whom drove the pickup truck away before disappearing. The case hit a dead end, until a neighbor provided a shocking statement. When the culprit was revealed, locals were stunned, as the suspect was known as a kind-hearted person who regularly visited temples. So, who murdered the British millionaire couple, and what grudge did they have against them? Let's uncover this horrific crime. This true crime took place in Phrae Province, northern Thailand. On September 19th, millionaire couple, Alan Hogg in Nod, Sudan, had scheduled a meeting with friends in Chiang Mai. However, when the couple failed to show up at the meeting and could not be reached by phone, suspicion arose among their friends. A British national, Alan Hogg was known for always being punctual at social gatherings. If he couldn't attend, he would certainly notify his friends several days in advance, so they could adjust their plans. After waiting for several days, with no sign of Alan and his wife, and with phone calls ringing but unanswered, the group of friends became increasingly concerned. Suspecting something had happened to the couple, one friend volunteered to visit their villa in Frey province to check on them. Arriving at Alan's large farm in Frey, on September 23rd, the friend searched the house, but found no trace of the couple. Inside, Alan's phone was still charging, and clothes and luggage remained untouched, indicating the couple hadn't left the house. The friend also noticed the pickup truck was missing from the garage. After a thorough inspection, the friend found bloodstains scattered in the dressing room that hadn't been cleaned. Fearing the worst, the friend immediately called the police to report the situation. Police in Frey province promptly arrived at the scene, collected testimonies, and launched an investigation. Alan Hogg and his wife lived in a 3-story villa situated on a sprawling 32-acre estate. Besides growing fruit trees, the couple also raised ducks and fish, which made the police search more challenging. Due to the vastness of the property, additional officers were dispatched to the scene to assist in the investigation. One officer discovered a recently dug and refilled patch of soil in the orchard near a duck pond. This detail was highly unusual, as no other part of the garden showed signs of being disturbed. The police then deployed sniffer dogs to investigate. Upon arriving at the suspicious area, the dogs began barking incessantly. Suspecting that the bodies of the millionaire couple might be buried beneath, the investigation team hired an excavator to dig. After nearly 2 hours of digging on the Hogg property, police finally unearthed the couple's bodies buried 2 meters deep near the duck pond. The crime scene immediately descended into chaos, with many family members and friends of the couple left in shock by the news. The victims' bodies were later transported to a forensic clinic to determine the cause and time of death. Meanwhile, another police team carried out investigations, collecting evidence and statements from those acquainted with the victims. Robin Hogg, the couple's daughter, flew from the UK to Thailand after learning of her parents' murder to assist with the investigation. Alan Hogg was originally from Edinburgh, Scotland. While vacationing in Thailand, he fell head over heels in love with a local woman named Nod Sodden. Alan was a well-known engineer and businessman. However, he resigned as director of the specialized dry cleaning company Clayful, based in Bonnyrigg, near Edinburgh, in July 2017. He had controlled 5,075 of the company's shares, and was listed as the sole individual with significant control of the until it was sold to Johnson Service Group that same month. Additionally, he managed another company called Sherwood Edinburgh, which was also sold to another party. Alan and his wife, Nod Sodden, frequently traveled back and forth between the UK and Thailand. The couple also owned another house in Australia, where they often vacationed during the summer. To residents of Frey province, Alan was regarded as a wealthy millionaire who preferred the simple, peaceful life of the countryside. Since 2014, the couple had officially settled in Thailand and built a 3-story home on their expansive property, complete with a swimming pool and a poultry farm. The brutal murder of Alan Hogg and Nod Sodden, whose bodies were buried in their garden, shocked the small rural community in northern Thailand. Since the case involved a foreign national, Thai police faced significant pressure to identify the perpetrator. Forensic results revealed that Alan died from 2 gunshot wounds, while Nod Sodden was killed with a wrench. The couple's time of death was determined to be around September 18th, one day before their scheduled meeting in Chiang Mai. The fact that the killer buried the victims on their own property made police suspect the perpetrator was someone they knew. Unable to move the bodies elsewhere, the murderer likely decided to bury them right next to the house. Nod Sodden's relatives described Alan as a kind and generous man who often lent them money during hard times. Meanwhile, Nod was known as a kind-hearted and gentle woman who took responsibility for caring for her disabled younger brother. Despite being married to a wealthy millionaire, Nod never came across as arrogant or conceited. Local residents confirmed that Alan and his wife had no conflicts or disputes with anyone in the area. Upon reviewing cameras inside and outside the property, police immediately uncovered a crucial lead. The person seen driving Alan's newly purchased white Ford Ranger pickup truck away was Werit Sachikit, 63, Nod's older brother. Police promptly launched a manhunt for Werit to question him, but he had disappeared from Frey province. When locals learned that Sachikit was the suspect police were pursuing, many expressed doubt, as he was known as a kind man. He was often seen helping neighbors and volunteering at a temple. Furthermore, the idea that Sachikit could murder his wealthy sister and brother-in-law seemed implausible, as he had worked with the couple for over 20 years. Despite public skepticism, police pressed forward with their search for where at Sachikit, as he had vanished, along with the victim's vehicle. However, some of Nod's relatives supported the police's suspicions, claiming that the relationship between Sachikit and the couple was not as harmonious as it appeared. Alan Hogg was a dynamic individual who, alongside his wife, had run a restaurant and a laundry business before returning to farming. Since the couple started their poultry farm raising ducks and geese and fry, the relationship between them and Sachikit had gradually deteriorated. As a European, Alan Hogg had high expectations when it came to work. He often appeared critical and dissatisfied with his brother-in-law's work habits. Meanwhile, Sachikit, being older, worked at a slower pace and lacked the efficiency of others. Additionally, Sachikit felt envious of his sister living in a fully equipped 3-story house while he remained in an old wooden home. On September 15th, Nod visited her youngest brother and complained about their older brother neglecting his work and becoming increasingly difficult to deal with. Moreover, whenever the couple tried to give him feedback, Sachikit would argue back, insisting he was right. Frustrated with his unwillingness to change, Nod and Alan demanded that Sachikit leave their farm. Based on information from the youngest brother, the police became even more convinced that Sachikit was the prime suspect. However, given his age, it was unlikely that Sachikit could have single-handedly murdered the couple and buried their bodies so efficiently. Police suspected that he had accomplices who assisted him in this horrific crime. Furthermore, evidence from the crime scene revealed bloodstains left on the sink and the floor. In the garage, they also discovered a wrench that had been unusually cleaned of oil and dirt, leaving it suspiciously polished. Believing the wrench to be the murder weapon used to kill Nod, police sent it for forensic analysis, which confirmed their suspicions. Additionally, CCTV footage showed that on September 18th, a strange man arrived at the farm, and it was Sachikit who greeted him. However, after the two men left, the CCTV cameras did not capture any further images of Alan and Nod. From this detail, police suspected the two strange men were accomplices who helped Sachikit murder and dispose of Alan and Nod. To capture Sachikit, police were determined to track down the stolen pickup truck he had taken from the victim's home. After days of searching, investigators discovered that the truck had been sold to a local resident living in the nearby hills for 200,000 baht. However, that person had resold the truck to a man from Laos for 430,000 baht. The man from Laos later drove the truck to Ayutthaya during a business trip. Upon learning about the murder case and the vehicle police were searching for, the man voluntarily handed the truck over to authorities. After recovering the vehicle, police also arrested Sachikit. However, to their surprise, he denied killing his sister and brother-in-law. Sachikit insisted that he had no involvement in the deaths of his sister and her husband. Without concrete evidence, and with CCTV only capturing Sachikit driving away, police were unable to detain him. After Sachikit was granted bail, police were forced to release him. The case hit a dead end, leaving police extremely concerned about their inability to apprehend the killer. Since the truck had been bought and sold multiple times, it was difficult for police to identify fingerprints on it. Amid the stalemate, a police officer suggested monitoring Sachikit's movements, as he remained the prime suspect. While one team followed Sachikit, another continued to search the crime scene for additional clues. At this point, a neighbor named Suma Utpaman, 50, unexpectedly appeared at the police station. No one could have predicted that this testimony would lead to the easiest capture of the culprit. Suma hesitantly admitted that, prior to the murders, War Sachikit had approached him for help in killing Alan Hogg. However, upon learning that Sachikit also intended to kill his own sister, Suma immediately refused. Still, Suma accepted 25,000 baht from Sachikit and introduced him to two strong men to carry out the heinous act. The two men Suma introduced were Pia Kamsai, 63, and Kittafong Kamwan, 24. After hearing Suma Utpaman's testimony, police immediately arrested him for aiding the crime and sent officers to apprehend the three suspects. Suma agreed to testify as a witness in exchange for a lighter sentence. With a cooperating witness, police quickly raided the suspects' homes and successfully arrested all three perpetrators. Waru Sachikit eventually confessed to all charges, admitting that he was the mastermind behind the murders of his sister and brother-in-law. He revealed that he had hired Pia Kamsai and Kitafong Kamwan for 50,000 baht to murder Alan Hogg and his wife, Nad Sudane. Police Chief Sampat Praputsa, the officer leading the investigation, ordered the three perpetrators to reenact the crime at the scene. Pia Kamsai confirmed that at around 6 p.m. on September 18, 2018, he and Kitafong were led into the farm by Sachikit. Pia was instructed to go to the back garden, where he found Alan feeding the ducks and shot him twice, killing him. Meanwhile, Kitafong found Nad in the kitchen, covered her mouth, dragged her to the garage, and pinned her to the ground. Sachikit then used a wrench to strike his sister on the head repeatedly until she died. The three murderers then dragged Nad's body to the duck pen, near where Alan had been killed. They used a pickaxe, shovels, and Alan's small excavator to dig a 2-meter-deep hole and push the couple's bodies into it. After finishing the job, Sachikit took the family's Ford Ranger truck and sold it. Based on the trio's testimony, police recovered the gun used to shoot Alan, which they had thrown into a creek between Wang Chin District and Long District. Whereat Sachikit confessed that he and his brother-in-law, Alan Hogg, had disagreements over how the farm was managed. Sachikit had been well loved by his sister, Nad, who allowed him to build a small wooden house on the couple's expansive property. Trusting her brother, Nad appointed Sachikit as the farm's head gardener. His duties included tending to the plants, maintaining the orchard, and caring for the chickens and 15 cows. However, during his time working on the farm, Alan and Sachikit frequently clashed. When Sachikit learned that the couple intended to evict him from the farm, he became furious. He felt he had been exploited by his brother-in-law, working for over a decade without receiving any proper compensation. When Sachikit demanded payment for managing the farm, Alan flatly refused. Feeling unjustly treated and angered further by Nad's siding with her husband, Sachikit's resentment grew. This only heightened his rage, as he knew that if he were evicted, his advanced age would make it nearly impossible to find another job. Additionally, Sachikit had nowhere to go, as he owned no house and had no children to support him. With the intention of murdering his sister and brother-in-law, Sachikit sought hitman to assist him. Lacking the money to pay the hitman, he came up with the idea of selling the newly purchased truck belonging to Alan and Nad. Due to legal restrictions on land and business ownership for foreigners, expatriates living in Thailand often register assets under the names of Thai relatives or associates. This is why Alan frequently purchased properties under the names of his wife's family members. Being wealthy, Alan and his wife acquired numerous properties, including land and houses, which were registered under Nad's siblings, including Sachikit. Even after Alan and Nad were murdered, some of their assets remained under the suspect's name. In fact, the couple's only daughter had even considered asking her uncle to help manage the farm if she relocated her parents to live in the UK. Unfortunately, Sachikit destroyed his own future and life in a moment of rage. After being arrested, Sachikit showed no remorse or regret for his actions. The fact that Sachikit hired hitman to kill his own sister and brother-in-law shocked the residents of Phrai Province. Nad's uncle, Sangwarn Sutikin, 78, confirmed that he saw her at his store on the morning of September 18th, and she seemed cheerful. He also stated that he had never heard Nad speak ill of her brother. If there had been any conflict, she would have likely kept it hidden from him and other relatives. Speaking about Weret Sachikit, Sangwarn also confirmed that his nephew was a kind and decent man. He was shocked to learn that Sachikit had hired people to kill his sister and brother-in-law over a minor family dispute. Prasith Sudan, 61, another uncle of Nad who lived just a few kilometers away, described Weret as a kind-hearted person. None of the relatives or local residents could have imagined that he was the perpetrator. A year after the murders, on June 3, 2019, the Phrai Provincial Court officially began the trial for the murders of Alan and Nad Hogg. Weret Ratanachijikit was identified as the mastermind who hired hitman to murder his sister and brother-in-law due to family conflicts. Police charged Weret with conspiring to commit murder to seize Hogg's assets and sell some of them. All three perpetrators, Weret Ratanachijikit, Pia Kamsai, and Kitafong Kamwan, were sentenced to death on multiple charges. Sumitwatpaman received a 25-year prison sentence, reduced by half from the initial 50 years due to his cooperation with the police during the investigation. The Phrai Provincial Court described the murder of the British millionaire as an act that severely damaged Thailand's reputation. Pawina Chwayen, the victim's family lawyer, stated that Alan's relatives in the UK were satisfied with the court's verdict. However, due to the cruelty and horrific nature of the case, they did not want to revisit this painful story. The case of the British millionaire, couple murdered by their brother-in-law over family conflicts, has now come to a close. Case 8. This case occurred in Sweden, but word of it quickly spread across news organizations worldwide. Because the crime committed against a 7-month pregnant woman was so atrocious, it left many wondering why. People have varied opinions about this, including whether it's related to the assimilation of refugees and immigrants into Swedish society. However, you be the judge and let me know in the comments. Let's go! On April 29, 2023, at 1 p.m., Melissa Elmborg arrived at her daughter Saga Elmborg's apartment complex to pick up a few items. The family was brimming with anticipation for the future. 20-year-old Saga was 31 weeks or 7 months pregnant with her partner Mohammed Amid Ibrahim, whom they affectionately called Amin. The young couple had been together since the fall of 2021, and they were expecting a healthy baby boy in June 2023. Saga was eager to become a mother, frequently sharing her pregnancy photos with friends and family. Her close-knit family were highly supportive of her journey into motherhood. Saga had been diligently preparing for the baby's arrival, enrolling in prenatal classes and gathering essential baby gear. Melissa had been living with Saga intermittently to assist her during pregnancy. She had left for a couple of nights, Thursday and Friday, April 27th and 28th, to give the couple some privacy. Upon arriving at the apartment, Melissa was on the phone with her other daughter, Julia. She rang the doorbell first, just in case Amin is running around naked, but no one answered. Irritated, she knocked and called through the response. When she went to unlock the door with her key, she noticed it was already unlocked. What the hell are they doing not locking the doors, she thought, puzzled. As Saga always locked the door, even for short trips to the basement or to collect the mail. Entering the apartment, Melissa heard water running from the kitchen faucet. She went to turn it off and then, to her horror, she saw Saga lying face up on the bedroom floor, her long dark hair covering her face. Melissa screamed in grief into the phone as she saw a marble top on top of Saga and a lamp cord around her neck, with no signs of life. Desperately, Melissa lifted the table and called emergency services immediately. She would later recall how doing CPR was of no use. Her daughter was too stiff. She also said her cold. Police and paramedics arrived swiftly, but tragically, both Saga and her unborn child were already deceased. The investigators cordoned off the area and began a murder investigation. Saga's body was found on the bedroom floor, between the bed and a TV stand, partially on a carpet. She lay on her back, head turned to the left, arms alongside her body, dressed in a pink ribbed set, pants, cardigan, and a top. Blood covered her face, particularly around her nose, mouth, left eye, and forehead. A long dark hair, matted with blood, obscured her face. Bleeding was visible, her tongue protruded, and blood trickled from her left nostril to her cheek. DNA traces were collected from under her nails and clothing. Impressions of the table base were found on her neck, thigh, trousers, and the carpet. Below the foot of the bed was a lamp with its cord loosely wound around Saga's neck. The lamp socket was under her left shoulder, with no damage observed on the lamp. The lamp's base was circular and measured about 8.5 centimeters in diameter. Upon examining the bedroom and the living room, investigators found all the drawers pulled out, with clothes scattered across the floor. Saga's cell phone was discovered on the bed, underneath a blanket. One pillow on the king-size bed had a depression, as if someone had been sleeping on it, whilst on the other one it did not, suggesting Saga had been lying on the bed all alone before being attacked. The washroom floor was littered with scattered jewelry boxes. There were no signs of forced entry on the balcony door or windows. In the kitchen, food was left in a frying pan on the stove. Shoe prints were collected throughout the apartment. Based on the crime scene, it did not appear that there had been much of a struggle. The coroner concluded that Saga was strangled and suffocated to death with a marble slab. The death struggle lasted for 5 to 10 minutes, with the estimated time of death around 1 a.m. to 3 a.m. on April 29th. Police began investigating the crime immediately on April 29th, starting with a series of interviews with Saga's family to piece together the events leading up to this tragic discovery. According to Saga's mother, Melissa, just the day before, on April 28th, Saga and a few friends had a meet-up at the Mocha Deli and everyone had a great time. But Saga appeared nervous, frequently checking her phone as she awaited a text from her boyfriend, Amin. Saga's anxiety stemmed from Amin's plan to inform his parents that he was going to be a father. At 7 months pregnant, Saga was understandably on edge about how this conversation would unfold. According to Melissa, Saga was worried about how Amines would react to the news. While her mom and friends continued with dinner, Saga decided to head back to her apartment around 7:30 p.m. Although Saga's family knew about her relationship with Amin and their upcoming baby, Amin's family had no idea. Amin had kept his relationship with Saga a secret from his family, who had arrived in Sweden as refugees from Somalia when he was just a child. They were devout Muslims, while Saga and her family were Christians. Amin believed his family would disapprove of his relationship with Saga, especially with her being pregnant out of wedlock. He had confided in Saga that his family might ostracize him if they knew the truth. Rumors circulated that Amin had been seeing other women while in a relationship with Saga. When Saga discovered she was pregnant, Amin initially tried to persuade her to have an abortion, fearing the repercussions from his family. Saga, however, was determined to keep the baby, saying she could raise the baby on her own if necessary. When she announced her pregnancy to her family in October the previous year, they were happy and willing to support her decision. Her grandmother shared some wisdom with her to think through how this would work for her and her baby, given her current financial situation, and whether her boyfriend was willing to take the next step and support them as a family. She also raised her concern with Amin's culture being very different than their Swedish upbringing. Over time, Amin seemed to accept the pregnancy and even agreed to move in together with Saga in a new, larger apartment on May 2nd, 2023, with him covering the rent. Melissa noted that, despite Saga and Amin being together for almost 2 years, she had only met Amin 3 times. This was surprising, given that their daughter was 7 months pregnant with his baby at the time of her death. Melissa also recalled overhearing a phone conversation between Saga and Amin, where Saga confronted Amin after a woman called Diana claimed Amin had asked her to kick Saga's belly to induce a miscarriage. Also, when Diana spoke to her daughter, she said she was sleeping with Amin. Amin managed to calm Saga down, convincing her it wasn't true. Given this story, when Melissa discovered her daughter's murder, she immediately urged the police to question Amin. The police first established a timeline of events. On April 27th to 28th, Amin took sick leave from work. On April 27th, Amin spent the afternoon and evening at Saga's home. Saga had given him an ultimatum to inform his family about their relationship, the move, and her pregnancy. On April 28th, Saga also called in sick from work. Amin was supposed to tell his family about their relationship that day at 10 p.m., when his mom would return from work. Amin was then to come and update Saga directly at her apartment that evening. She expected him around 11 p.m. and was messaging him nervously all day. Her anxiety was noticed by her mom and her friends during the deli. The police discovered that between 11:13 and 11:15 p.m. on April 28th, Amin wrote a message to Saga stating that he would not tell his parents about her and that they wouldn't move in together because he couldn't lose his family. However, he never sent the messages. These facts established Amin as a primary suspect, suggesting a motive for the crime. Instead of telling his family as he claimed he would, he went over to Saga's place. The question was, what happened there? Was it an escalation or a premeditation? Interestingly, police learned that Amin's mom had returned home far earlier than 10 p.m. that day, arriving at 3 p.m. Did Amin already speak with her when Saga was messaging him all day? Or did he fail to muster the courage to tell her at all? Or was this all a ruse to string Saga along with no intention of following through? The police confronted Amin and took him in for questioning. The key updates from the interrogations are as follows. When initially informed about a murder that happened at an apartment in Kungsgatan 36B, which was Saga's apartment, Amin remained calm and even joked around with the detectives. They found it strange that he didn't mention anything about his girlfriend living at the address, pretending not to know the location at all. He did ask who died there, and then strangely questioned the police about how he could possibly kill someone the previous day. When informed that a woman, Saga, was murdered, Amin immediately claimed he was not responsible for her death, stating he had an alibi for the night, and that he last saw her the previous day on April 27th, which contradicted his earlier display of ignorance of the location. Due to this strange behavior, contradicting statements, and the accumulating evidence pointing to him as the primary suspect, police arrested Amin and placed him in custody. Fast forward a few months, and Amin was on trial for the murder of his heavily pregnant girlfriend. The prosecution presented compelling evidence, stating that Amin's DNA was found on the stairs near Saga's apartment door on April 29 at 7:20 p.m. This evidence was significant because the tracking dog, Amina, traced the scent and is known to detect scents only up to 24 hours. This strongly suggested that Amin was present at Saga's apartment on the 28th, contradicting his claim of not being there. The defense objected to this evidence, arguing that the tests were conducted outdoors. However, Inspector Hannah Hockstrom testified that the difficulty level for the dog remained the same regardless of being indoors or outdoors. Prosecutor Elizabeth Anderson stated that Amin killed his girlfriend by, quote, suffocating and strangling her through pressure on her neck, impacting her trachea and the blood supply to her head. Amin entered her apartment using the spare key while Saga was asleep on the bed, as indicated by the depression on the side of the pillow. He attacked her, and they ended up on the floor besides the bed. Initially, he likely used the but then dragged the 30-kilogram or 66-pound marble tabletop and jammed it against her throat, suffocating her with his weight. As Saga was heavily pregnant, she would have struggled to get up under the crushing weight of the table, which left impressions on her neck and thigh. It's estimated she struggled for about 5 to 10 minutes before succumbing. Amin then staged pulling out drawers in the room and scattering jewelry on the floor to simulate a robbery. In court, Amin claimed that Saga might have been killed by a gang searching for drugs. He alleged that he had received a bag containing a large amount of money and other illegal items, and he had previously used some of the contents, which would have infuriated them. When confronted by the gang, he pointed them to Saga's apartment, but they didn't know he had used some of the contents. He claimed the gang must have broken into Saga's apartment and killed her when they found some of their property missing. However, this story was inconsistent with the district court's findings. If Amin feared the gangs, he wouldn't be living openly and freely in his own residence. There were also no leads, DNA, or forensic evidence linking these alleged illegal items to the crime. And if such property existed, only the killer would know exactly where to find it. Amin claims Saga had no idea about this, so why was her place not ransacked convincingly? This statement worked against him, as it proved only the killer would know precisely where the contraband was. It appeared more likely that Amin fabricated the story, as his friends Samir Taleb and Abdi swore under oath they were unaware of any gang affiliation of Amin. Amin's DNA was found on Saga's clothes and under her left nails. Amin claimed they had sexual intercourse on April 27th, explaining the presence of his DNA due to their passionate encounter throughout the apartment. He claimed he never visited her apartment on the 28th. Additional circumstantial evidence used in the trial included phone records from November 2022 showing that Amin did ask Diana Hussein to kick Saga's belly to induce a miscarriage. Amin's cell phone records also showed that he had Googled, quote, "Can fetuses die from kicking?" One of the most revealing details came from examining the text messages exchanged between Saga and Amin on the day she was murdered. Saga tries to cheer him up before his meeting with his family. He says, "Feels like I can almost feel my heartbeat all the way down to my stomach." Voila! Saga says, "Just take it easy, it'll be fine, babe, talk to me." After a while he responded again, saying he had told one person, and they took it in stride. However, according to the prosecutor, there was nothing in the investigation to indicate that Amin told his family about Saga that evening. Saga's last message was sent shortly after midnight on April 29th. "Baby, talk to me." It's alleged that Amin's cell phone was already turned off, and he was on his way to her apartment to end her life. After a trial that garnered much public interest in Swedish society, Muhammad Amin Ibrahim, or Amin's fate, rested in the balance. The prosecutors reasoned with these facts. Amin had been found to have motives to get rid of both his relationship and his unborn son. No one else is suspected to have a motive to harm Saga. Because the apartment showed no signs of forced entry, the locks were intact, and there were no signs of break-in. There's no reason to believe that Saga would let anyone in easily, especially as it was near midnight. It had to be someone familiar to her. Amin had a set of keys to her apartment, so he could have also entered by unlocking the door. There were no signs of a struggle that left an impression on the furniture or otherwise on the apartment, suggesting Saga was caught off guard by someone familiar to her like Amin. The DNA found in the stairwell by the sniffer dog also pointed to the fact that Amin was at Saga's apartment on the 28th, and not just the 27th, strongly suggesting Amin was the one who carried out the crime. Amin's semen was found on the clothes Saga wore when she was murdered, and both front and back of the body. This led to debates in court on whether Saga showered recently, or if she was wearing unwashed clothes. Because if the DNA was from before, it doesn't support the prosecution's claim that Amin was definitely there on the 28th. The DNA under fingernails also brought up the question about Saga showering often. Her mom attested that she showered at least once a day and washed her hands often, especially as she was pregnant and did not want to fall sick. Had Amin only been there on the 27th, there would have been ample opportunities to wash off his DNA under her fingernails. The morning after the murder, Amin deleted Saga from Snapchat and deleted the last day's text messages and calls from Saga, but they were still retrieved. This clearly suggested that Amin was trying to cover his tracks before the police even spoke to him. Saga's phone activities the day before her death were clearly obtained, but Amin's were a different story. On April 28th at 8 p.m. her cell phone connected to a telephone tower near her residence and remained there consistent with her returning and staying home. She seemed to use her phone constantly between 12:53 a.m. on April 29th, but then her activity ceased. Before this, Saga's phone showed several attempts to contact Amin and interactions with his friend Samir, trying to get him to contact Amin. On the flip side, Amin's phone and his alibi for the night led to some shocking revelations. Amin claimed that he was sitting in a car with his friend Amir, and Amir was occupied in a long phone call, but examining this in detail revealed a very different picture. From 12:22 a.m. to 1:57 a.m., Amin's phone was left unused, and he received a call from his friend Samir at 12:28 a.m., but it was unanswered. Saga had asked Samir to check up on Amin. At that precise moment, the phone signal placed it near Saga's address, which is contradictory to Amin's statements that he was far away with his friend Amir. Also, detectives found it implausible that he was just sitting in the car next to his friend and not using his phone at all. The time that his cell phone was unused coincided with the time it is unaccounted for in his alibi, providing the opportunity he had to commit the murder between the window of 12:28 a.m. to 3:30 a.m. Also, both Amir and Amin's cell phones were mysteriously turned off at precisely 2:16 a.m., while Amin's phone still had 40% charge remaining. This suggests one person had both phones on hand. His phone being turned off was also an unusual pattern, given the previous days and times of use. Finally, during the initial questioning, Amin outright said he had an alibi for the night of the 28th, which was a strange thing to say, before he was even asked about it, indicating he may have pre-planned what he was going to say when he was questioned by the police. Despite the lack of clear direct evidence in this case, the circumstantial evidence was considered strong enough to assess the case in its entirety, but some were hopeful that the lack of direct evidence could not prove without a reasonable doubt that Amin was guilty of the crime. The one piece of evidence that seems unanswered was the footprint found in Saga's apartment that did not match Amin. Nevertheless, this does not rule out Amin being there on the 28th. Amin completely denies any wrongdoing. "Yes, I have been in denial for 9 months, now," he said in one of his last interrogations, and meant that he loved Saga. Also, the investigation into Amin's fears that his family would disown him for dishonoring the family name was found to be inconclusive. In short, no evidence seems to indicate the family was even aware of his expectant girlfriend, and that he had told them they would move in together a week later. It's likely Amin made up this excuse hiding behind his religion and Somali heritage, and we'll never know if his family would welcome their baby and Saga with open arms into their lives. Swedish court chairman Lars Gunnar Lund stated this is an honor-related crime, and the Swedish police even defined their version of this type of crime. According to the prosecutor, Mohammed Amin Ibrahim lived in an honorable context of his own definition, where he was not allowed to be with, quote, white women. On June 5th, 2024, 22-year-old Mohammed Amin Ibrahim was sentenced to life in prison for the murder of Saga, unanimous in its decision. Amin continues to deny any wrongdoing, quote, "I love Saga and our common child, and have never had any thoughts, ideas, or plan to kill Saga. Violence is not in my nature," he said during the trial. Amin and his defense lawyer believe that the perpetrator must be someone else, and they plan to appeal the verdict. Case 9. This is the true story of a young woman named Wu Xiaoyan from Zhejiang Province, China. Wu Xiaoyan was born in 1987 into a poor family in a remote mountain village. As a child, Wu was just like many other little girls, possessing a cute and pretty appearance with big, round, sparkling black eyes. Since her parents were farmers, she often helped her father with farm work, and the neighbors praised her for being a well-behaved and understanding child. She never gave her parents any reason to worry or trouble themselves about her. When she started primary school, Wu Xiaoyan was one of the top students in her class. However, a fateful turning point occurred when she was only 8 years old and in the 2nd grade. She began noticing that she couldn't see the words her teacher wrote on the blackboard clearly. Her eyes often itched, teared up, and felt a burning sensation. One day after school, she asked her mother why her eyes always felt blurry, as if a foggy layer was covering her vision. But her mother didn't pay much attention to her question, thinking it was just the idle talk of a child. Knowing her parents were busy working, Wu didn't ask further and went on with her daily life as usual. In the following days at school, she squinted to read the words on the blackboard, but found it increasingly difficult. When Wu Xiaoyan told her teacher about the issue, she was merely advised to maintain good eye hygiene and rest more. A few months later, her vision deteriorated so severely that she could no longer see the writing on the blackboard. Noticing her declining academic performance, her teacher contacted Xiaoyan's parents to inform them about the situation. Everyone found it strange, as she had been the top student in her class, yet her grades had suddenly plummeted. In the mid-1990s in China, televisions were an expensive household item that only well-off families could afford. In this poor rural area, families with black and white TVs could be counted on one hand. Naturally, Xiaoyan's family did not own one. Adults found it puzzling that, with no TV at home and her time spent either studying or working in the fields, her eyesight could decline so rapidly. When questioned by the adults, she recounted her inability to see clearly, the burning sensation in her eyes, and the persistent blurry, foggy layer obstructing her vision. At that moment, her mother remembered the comment her daughter had made months earlier, but had brushed aside. Realizing the situation might be serious, the family took her to the district hospital for an examination. However, due to the hospital's poor resources, lacking professional medical equipment, the doctors could only perform a basic checkup. After hearing about her condition, they merely prescribed her eye drops to alleviate the strain. A few weeks later, the prescribed eye drops ran out, but her vision showed no improvement. Thinking it was nothing serious, her family bought more eye drops for her, hoping she would recover. This continued until Wu Xiaoyan turned 9 years old and entered the 3rd grade of primary school. Then tragedy struck. At that time, Xiaoyan's face suddenly became abnormally swollen. She constantly complained about a crawling sensation on her face, which was very itchy and uncomfortable. Her parents could only apply an ointment to her face to temporarily reduce the swelling. A week later, they were shocked to discover that their daughter's face had changed dramatically. Xiaoyan's nose had swollen unusually, pushing her eyes farther apart, and the distance between her eyes began to widen. After that, her face continued to grow larger, and the effects on her face made it impossible for Xiaoyan to sleep at night. At this point, her parents realized the severity of the situation and took their daughter to the district hospital for a checkup. However, the doctors were unable to determine what illness she had, as the hospital's infrastructure was still rudimentary and lacked modern equipment. They speculated that she might have contracted a rare disease with an unknown cause and only prescribed some anti-inflammatory and swelling-reducing medication. Over time, Xiaoyan's face continued to swell larger, despite her taking the medication diligently. Teased by her classmates and overcome with shame, she decided to drop out of school and stayed home to practice writing on her own. News of the girl with the strange face quickly spread throughout the impoverished rural area. Many people came to her house just to see Wu Xiaoyan's unusual face for themselves. Within just a few months, her nose became even more severely deformed, almost entirely destroyed. A large swelling completely obscured her nose, making it unrecognizable unless examined closely. This also caused her to face significant difficulties, especially frequent episodes of difficulty breathing. Meanwhile, her eyes became bulging, and her strange face terrified many people. Villagers began calling her the horse-faced girl because her face resembled that of the animal. Feeling insecure about her disfigured face, and fearing both scaring others and being mocked, she stayed hidden at home all day. While some people sympathized with her family, others spread rumors about the cause of her condition. Some villagers speculated that her transformation into a horse-like face was due to her family's eating habits. In this poor, remote, mountainous district, people were extremely frugal with food. When livestock or poultry died from disease, they wouldn't bury or dispose of them, but often turned them into meals. Wu's family was no exception. They frequently used sick or dead pigs, chickens, and ducks as food to improve their household's nutrition. Upon hearing this, Xiaoyan's parents became worried, believing that their daughter had eaten contaminated food, which might have caused her illness. From then on, the family changed their daily diet. In addition, following advice from some villagers to use traditional Chinese medicine, her grandparents decided to try it. They searched for various strange folk remedies, ground them into pastes, and applied them to their granddaughter's face. However, Xiaoyan opposed this method because the paste caused a burning sensation and extreme pain on her face. Seeing that this approach wasn't effective, her grandparents then forced her to drink herbal medicines to treat her condition. After a period of using her grandparents' folk remedies, her face not only didn't improve, but swelled even more. To treat her, the family could only go to the hospital to get anti-inflammatory and pain relief medication. Over time, rumors about the horse-faced girl spread further across the district. Some malicious individuals even claimed her family was cursed and that the gods had cast a spell on their daughter. They speculated that the Wu family had offended the gods, or that someone had cursed their only daughter as an act of revenge. Xiaoyan had once been the pride of her family, and her parents had high hopes for her bright future. Believing that their granddaughter was being punished by the gods or harmed by an evildoer, her grandparents suggested the family invite a shaman to perform an exorcism. Her parents spent a large sum of money on a cleansing ritual for their daughter, hoping her face would return to normal. However, contrary to their belief, Xiaoyan's face remained unchanged. Knowing her strange illness was causing her family so much worry and sorrow, Xiaoyan's temperament also changed. She began locking herself in the house every day, never stepping outside. To help her feel less uncomfortable, her parents removed all the mirrors from their home. Even so, she still felt uneasy inside and envied her peers, who could go to school and play games like hide-and-seek together. And so, Xiaoyan spent years confined to her house. Although there were no mirrors in her room, she could still feel with her hands that her face had continued to swell even more. As years passed, Xiaoyan grew into a young woman. While girls at this age often enjoy dressing up, she was the opposite. Not only did she stay locked inside her house for over a decade, but whenever she went out, she used a cloth to completely cover her head and face so no one could see her unusual appearance. Her family's life had already been difficult, and over the years they spent a significant amount of money on her treatments, but none of them brought any results. However, another terrible misfortune struck this unfortunate family. Witnessing her daughter's prolonged suffering, Xiaoyan's mother became increasingly worried. She worked both on the farm and took on extra jobs in hopes of earning enough money to take her daughter to a major city for medical treatment. Working day and night took a toll on her body, and Xiaoyan's mother suffered a stroke due to a brain hemorrhage. Although she was rushed to the hospital in time and her life was saved, she fell into a vegetative state. This placed an even greater burden on Xiaoyan's father, Wu Lirong. He now had to bear the cost of his daughter's treatment, as well as the hospital bills for his wife. Since he was often away from home working, the responsibility of caring for her mother was left to Xiaoyan. After suffering from her illness for decades, Xiaoyan had also lost her vision. To adapt and avoid relying too much on her father, Xiaoyan learned how to live in darkness. She practiced identifying objects by touch, washing vegetables, cooking, cleaning, and performing tasks proficiently. Occasionally, her cooking was too salty because she added too much salt, but her father still ate everything out of appreciation for her efforts. Even the care for her mother was done entirely by Xiaoyan to ease her father's burden. However, because she couldn't see, Xiaoyan sometimes couldn't avoid unexpected accidents. One day, while preparing a meal, she tripped over a chair and fell. The severe impact caused the large tumor on her face to rupture badly. Fortunately, it was raining that day, so her father was home. Seeing his daughter bleeding heavily after the fall, he rushed her to the provincial hospital. Upon arrival at the hospital, the doctors were shocked by her severely deformed face. After regaining their composure, they stopped the bleeding, bandaged her wound, and conducted a series of tests to identify the disease. By this time, it was 2009, and Wu Xiaoyan was 22 years old. With the help of modern equipment, the doctors at the provincial hospital suspected she had optic nerve tumors. This rare and strange disease was neither caused by diet nor the divine punishment rumored by the villagers. Hearing the doctor's confirmation, Mr. Wu felt as though a burden that had plagued his family for decades had finally been lifted. He hoped that his daughter could undergo surgery to live a normal life. However, Xiaoyan's physical condition at that time was far from ideal. The fall had caused her to lose 1,000 milliliters of blood. The doctors were very concerned about her condition, as she had lost nearly a quarter of the total blood volume in the human body. This was an extremely dangerous situation because any delay could have been fatal for the patient. Since the swelling on her face had ruptured, the best option was to proceed with surgery as soon as possible. Hearing the doctor's remarks, Mr. Wu felt overwhelmed. He desperately wanted to arrange surgery for his daughter as soon as possible, but the family had completely run out of money. They were just farmers, and when Xiaoyan's mother fell ill, their expenses had suddenly skyrocketed. Even with Mr. Wu taking on extra work outside, their income was insufficient, and they occasionally had to borrow money from relatives. While Wu Liirong was fretting over the cost of surgery, a doctor suggested letting journalists report on Xiaoyan's condition. Through this, they could receive donations from people across the country. After learning about this suggestion, Mr. Wu wanted to try it, but feared that his daughter would feel ashamed if she found out. His daughter was only 22 years old, and he worried that being filmed and interviewed by many people might embarrass her because of her horse-like face. However, faced with the harsh reality of his wife bedridden from a brain hemorrhage, he had no choice but to tell Xiaoyan about going public with her story. Upon hearing this, Xiaoyan expressed her willingness to be interviewed and allowed reporters to film and make a feature story about her. Mr. Wu, knowing he couldn't afford the expensive medical costs, also agreed to be interviewed to share his daughter's life story. Once major media outlets began reporting, the news about the strange horse-faced girl spread like wildfire across Zhejiang province. The story even circulated throughout China, with numerous articles calling for donations to support the father and daughter. Some people were curious about Xiaoyan's horse face, but many expressed sympathy for her and compassion for the poor family. Within just a few weeks, over $11,000 was raised for the horse-faced girl to undergo surgery. However, when they returned to the hospital full of hope, the doctor expressed uncertainty about the surgery's success, as the chance of recovery was only 0.1 per thousand. This statement felt like a cold splash of water on the heartbroken father. The doctor at the provincial hospital suggested the father and daughter go to the Sun Yat-sen University-affiliated hospital in Guangzhou. It was a facility with many skilled doctors and advanced equipment capable of performing the surgery successfully. At the same time, Xiaoyan's story was covered by Liaoning Satellite Television, Guangzhou Daily, and other media outlets. Hundreds more people donated to the poor girl, and the family received an additional $25,000. This money helped the father and daughter embark on their journey to Guangzhou for diagnosis and treatment. In early March 2010, Mr. Wu took his daughter on a train to Guangzhou, the longest journey Xiaoyan had taken in 14 years. One day in March, a peculiar girl arrived at the outpatient building of the Sun Yat-sen University-affiliated hospital in Guangzhou. The petite girl wore a pink scarf over her head, which piqued the curiosity of both doctors and patients. When she met the doctors, she explained that she had to cover her head because she felt too ugly and feared scaring others. Hearing this, the medical staff present felt even more intrigued. With the encouragement of the doctors, Xiaoyan hesitantly lifted her scarf. Daughter, Liao Guiqing, the head of maxillofacial surgery, was shocked upon seeing the patient's nearly completely deformed face. In all his years of medical practice, it was the first time he had encountered such a case. In the middle of her face was a massive protrusion that pushed her eyes far apart, making her nose and mouth barely visible upon close examination. Her face had completely lost the proportions and contours of a normal human, resembling that of a horse. After performing a CT scan, the doctors discovered a large foreign mass in the middle of her cheek the size of an outward protruding skull, which spanned her entire face and destroyed its structure. Her eyes had been pushed to the sides of her face, leaving her blind. Her nose was flattened, resulting in the loss of her sense of smell and difficulty breathing. Her mouth had been compressed toward her chin, allowing her to breathe only with great difficulty. At the Sun Yat-sen University-affiliated hospital, doctors conducted a series of tests on the young woman. The results were surprising, completely overturning the previous diagnosis given at the Zhejiang Provincial Hospital. Wu Xiaoyan was not suffering from optic nerve tumors, but from a condition called fibrous dysplasia. This disease occurs due to a genetic mutation on chromosome 20. The gene mutation causes fibrous cells to rapidly develop and replace bone cells, creating an abnormal type of fibrous bone. When nerves are compressed by fibrous bone tissue or affected bones in the face, patients experience vision loss, bulging eyes, and other symptoms. Xiaoyan's jawbone had not calcified, but over time, the fibrous bone lengthened and accumulated on her face, forming a large swelling. She had been living with this disease for 13 years, so it had progressed to a very severe stage. The doctors presented her family with an urgent solution: surgery to remove the swelling on her face, though it carried significant risks. The surgery posed a risk of death, but if left untreated, she would continue living in misery, tormented by her illness. Xiaoyan and her father thought deeply about it, and eventually decided to take the risk and proceed with the surgery. She said she didn't care about the success rate of the operation, but only knew that it was her only hope. She didn't want to continue living as the horse-faced girl, or have to cover her face with a scarf every time she went outside. The courage and determination of the father and daughter deeply inspired the doctors. Although the surgery would be extremely challenging, the medical team resolved to do their best to minimize risks and developed a detailed plan. First, they would make an incision in the center of her face to remove the large swelling, then proceed to fix her upper jaw and forehead bones with titanium plates while pulling her chin back into its original position. Next, they would clean the nasal cavity, reposition her eyes into their sockets, and use titanium mesh to secure the eyeballs in place. Finally, the excess skin in the middle of her face would be removed and sutured according to the newly reconstructed facial contours. This surgical plan, developed by specialists from multiple departments, involved using titanium plates and mesh to reconstruct the patient's face. The night before the surgery, both Xiaoyan and her father were somewhat anxious. She wanted to call her mother to inform her about the operation, but her father refused. Mr. Wu Lirong didn't dare tell his daughter the truth that her mother had passed away a week before the surgery was scheduled. All the relatives decided to keep this secret, fearing that if Xiaoyan found out, she would suffer psychological shock. As expected, the surgery was intense and faced many challenges. From the very first step, blood gushed out like a stream, so quickly that even the most experienced doctors were stunned. Due to the massive blood loss, Xiaoyan's blood pressure and heart rate immediately dropped to the lowest levels. Thanks to the doctor's experience, calmness, decisiveness, courage, and meticulousness, Xiaoyan miraculously survived many life-threatening moments. After more than 9 hours, the surgery was a great success, with over 90% of the massive tumor on her face removed, weighing up to 2 kilograms. After stitching, her face was reduced to half its previous size. Her eyeballs returned to their normal position. Her nasal cavity allowed her to breathe more easily, and she could eat normally through her mouth. The only drawback was that her eyes remained blind because the treatment had come too late. The tumor had grown in the area of her optic nerves, compressing them and causing permanent blindness. After his daughter recovered, Mr. Wu finally told her the news of her mother's death. To everyone's surprise, the 22-year-old girl didn't cry but calmly accepted the news, perhaps because she had grown more mature after the life-and-death surgery. Over the next 6 months, Xiaoyan underwent 2 more surgeries, mainly to reconstruct her face to make it as normal as possible. Xiaoyan felt very proud because from now on, she could bravely go outside without having to cover her head with a scarf like before. After she recovered and returned to her hometown, everyone came to visit and encourage her. Charitable organizations and government agencies frequently visited and brought her gifts. Notably, Xiaoyan even found a job doing handicraft work, earning a few dozen yuan each month. In 2012, she went back to the hospital for a follow-up examination, where the doctors gave her a scarf as a gift. Everyone encouraged her and hoped that she would soon find a good man to marry. While she longed for love, she felt hesitant, believing that her blindness would make it unlikely for anyone to want to marry her. In November 2017, Xiaoyan's relatives introduced her to a man named Lin Yao. He was 11 years older than her and had previously suffered from polio, making it difficult for him to walk. Perhaps because both had experienced great hardships, they found many things in common and got along very well. Although Xiaoyan couldn't see Yi's face, she could feel the care and attention he gave her. Xiaoyan felt that although her boyfriend was much older, age didn't matter as long as he treated her well. In October 2018, Xiaoyan went for a follow-up examination at the hospital, accompanied by her boyfriend. She also brought many gifts for the medical staff at the Sun Yat-sen University-affiliated hospital. They were the ones who gave her a new life, allowing her to reintegrate into society with a new appearance. The doctors told her that as she aged, the tumor would grow more slowly until it eventually stopped developing. Although the tumor wouldn't metastasize, there was still a risk of recurrence, so she would need to visit the hospital for checkups 3 to 5 times a year. Currently, Xiaoyan and Li Miao are married and have a child together. The story of the horse-faced girl, who had to cover her head with a scarf for 13 years whenever she went outside, ends here. Case 10. Nancy Marie Benelak was born in Grass Valley, California. She spent her childhood years in the school of Hennessy, later moving on to Nevada Union High School, where she excelled in athletics. She played softball and handled the role of song leader during her school songs and other festivities. Bowling was her leisure activity of choice, and she loved practicing this hobby with friends and family alike. Even though her figure was relatively slender, Nancy had quite a fierce appetite, according to her sister Linda Cox. After graduating from beauty school, Benelak started working at a beauty center situated on South Auburn Street. A friend of hers persuaded her to come with her on a trip to Hawaii. There, she found employment at another beauty salon before returning to California, where she secured a position as a court reporter. If only she knew the gruesome horror that awaited her upon her return. On the night of October 25, 1970, Nancy and her fiancé, Faris Salami, returned to her apartment after a social outing. After spending time with Nancy, her fiancé went home later that same evening. In the few days preceding her untimely passing, Benelak spent the majority of her time with her fiancé, Faris Salami, who was chief public defender. In fact, the two were planning to marry within weeks of that evening. According to what Salami told detectives, Nancy was lying in bed when he said goodbye to her at approximately 11:30 p.m. Before heading off to his own home, Faris stated that Nancy always left the sliding door to the nearby balcony slightly open to allow her cat to go in and out if it ever felt like going outside. The following day, her coworkers noticed that Nancy had failed to show up to work. Linda Cox, Nancy's sister, was among the first people to suspect something was wrong. This was shortly after she received a call from the place Nancy worked at, letting her know she didn't show up that day and asking if everything was okay. Linda quickly called up a few of her friends who lived next to Nancy's home and asked them to check if Nancy's car was still in the parking lot, and they let her know that it was. Shortly afterward, one of Nancy's coworkers called her son, Jack, and asked him to check up on her. With the assistance of the apartment manager, they entered her residence. They found Nancy dead with stab marks. Upon arriving at the scene, deputies discovered that this case had many parallels to Judith Hikari's murder, which occurred earlier that year. Both women were nearly the same age and resided less than a mile away from each other. Furthermore, they were both getting married soon. Other than that, deputies weren't able to find anything else linking the two cases together. Following Nancy's murder, the sheriff's office interviewed over 500 potential suspects. Among those were Richard John Davis and a roommate of his, but both provided strong alibis for one another. Davis, who lived across the apartment complex from where the crime took place, was 27 years old at the time and had a history of being an unstable alcoholic who was prone to violence. Still, investigators didn't have a strong reason to suspect Davis, as the evidence led them to believe that the attacker must have gotten into a car and driven away from the area after killing Benelak, which indicated the man was, most likely, an outsider to the neighborhood. While this was happening, crime scene investigators were working hard to determine what exactly transpired on that fateful night. It was later theorized that during the evening of October 25th or early morning hours of the 26th, a male, likely suspect, entered Nancy's apartment by climbing up to the second-story balcony and through the open slider. The man clambered over the balcony with duct tape on his fingers to hide his fingerprints before breaking into Nancy's residence. To accomplish this, the killer had to be agile, which meant the culprit must have been young, most likely under the age of 30. Furthermore, an ominous trail of crimson-red blood was found running from the balcony, across the sidewalk, and ending in the parking lot. This led investigators to believe that the suspect may have left with a knife wound, since the blood trail leading out of Nancy's apartment indicated a cut most likely sustained on either the hand or arm. Although crime scene investigation methods have vastly improved since 1970, back then, technological limitations hindered what investigators could learn from examining a crime scene. For example, while analysts could identify someone's blood type, sadly, that was about the extent of it. In 2004, almost 40 years after Benelak was killed, a new ray of hope emerged. Investigators were able to develop a DNA profile using samples from Nancy's apartment. For many years afterward, law enforcement ran the offender's DNA through state and national databases on a weekly basis. Unfortunately, all attempts proved rather pointless, as the suspect either seemed to have given up his life of crime after his latest murder, or somehow managed to avoid being caught while staying under the radar for decades. In a semblance of hope, Nancy's family had soon begun to vanish once more. Then, a year later, in 2005, homicide detective Mickey Lynx began looking for Nancy's killer. Mickey would go on to retire a few years after, but continued to follow the case closely nonetheless. In 2019, she rejoined the investigation as a volunteer, determined to help Nancy's family find comfort and bring her murderer to justice. Then, in November 2019, the Sheriff's Office and District Attorney's Office launched a forensic genetic genealogy investigation. They uploaded a DNA profile onto the open-source genealogy website in an effort to hopefully find people who might be related to the suspect and narrow their search until an ideal match was found. Eventually, a source for the DNA was found, although it did not belong to anyone on the database. Police also began collecting DNA samples from all the likely suspects or their closest relatives, hoping to find a match that would put Nancy's case to rest once and for all. Among those who provided DNA samples was Davis's own daughter. During the search efforts, it would seem Lynx managed to get in touch with Davis's roommate. The roommate couldn't remember how he'd met Davis or why he moved in to live with him, but he did recall that Davis had gotten a divorce at the time, and that the woman Davis was married to later gave birth to a baby girl. Davis never made any effort to connect with his daughter later on, nor did he provide for her whilst growing up. Detective Lynx sought out and eventually met with said daughter, who was in her 50s at the time. Davis's daughter agreed to help out by giving investigators her DNA upon hearing Nancy's case. On the 13th of June, 2022, which coincided with Nancy's birthday, her sister Linda received a phone call from Mickey that would change everything. Lynx had received a sample of DNA matching that of Richard Davis from the laboratory. She followed up with the original murder casebook. With no initial, middle, or birth date attached to go by, she needed more information to solve the case. However, after finding an old listing that stated that Richard Davis was, in fact, a former resident of the same apartment complex where Nancy was murdered, all the puzzle pieces began falling into place. By running samples of the daughter's DNA against blood samples taken the night of Nancy's murder, Lynx was both shocked and relieved to find that it was a match. The truth was finally revealed. Detective Mickey Lynx's valiant efforts were what eventually led to the Sacramento County Sheriff's Office announcement, the one where they revealed that, at the time, 27-year-old John Davis was, in fact, the man responsible for Nancy Benelak's murder. Davis had never truly fled the crime scene, as police investigators suspected. Rather, he'd been living close to where he'd committed his heinous crime for years. While the truth was finally out, unfortunately, it was bittersweet, as both Ferris Salami, Nancy's would-be betrothed, and Richard Davis, her killer, had died in 2004 and 1997, respectively, meaning that, sadly, there would be no closure for Ferris nor any punishment for Davis. Still, Nancy's sister, Linda, along with her husband, Tom, was relieved to have finally learned the truth. While Richard Davis's death as a result of alcoholism-related complications meant he never faced punishment for his crimes, at least it meant that Linda and Tom could, at last, begin the healing process together, and not have to worry about undergoing a long and arduous trial that may very well have taken years. The fact that Davis broke into Nancy's apartment on the night of the murder through the slightly open glass door and covered his fingers with tape suggests that Nancy's murder was, in all likelihood, premeditated. Although Davis's motive was unknown, detectives speculated that he may have had romantic feelings for Nancy and killed her out of spite or anger upon hearing she was getting married. While Davis was later questioned by detectives alongside his roommate, it would seem that, luckily for him, none of them thought to check his arms for knife wounds. Had they done so, Davis would have likely spent the rest of his life behind bars. Furthermore, while Davis did have a reputation for being quick to anger, he still managed to avoid being added to the Cody's database. This was because he had no prior convictions except for a minor DUI charge. In a statement read by Sheriff spokesman, Lieutenant Rodney Grassman, Linda said her family was grateful to Lynx for never giving up on the investigation. She also mentioned that she had almost lost hope that the case would be solved. Linda, in a later written statement, mentioned how often she and her husband, Tom, have expressed their belief that Nancy would have loved their ranch, with all the animals roaming in the wide open spaces. They went on to state how much they were tormented by the reality of being unable to news of their children and grandchildren with Nancy, but were nonetheless happy that Nancy's soul was finally at peace.